OK 啊，我可以講嘢啦嘛。OK。Hello everyone. Good morning. I'm Brian, the Associate Director of the Academy of Hong Kong Study. Welcome to the day 2 of the Hong Kong Study Annual Conference. I'm sorry that because of some technical problem, the live streaming has been delayed for a little bit. But anyway, thanks for joining us online. In day 2, in the morning sections of day 2, we will have 2 dialogues, both about books. Okay. In these sections, we will have a book talk series about 2 book series relating to Hong Kong study, and then we will have a book talk about the future of one country system between Professor Anthony Cheung and Professor Lui Tai Lok. So we come to the first section first. In these first sections, we will talk about some new book series about Hong Kong study. As about 5 years ago, in 2015, at that time when I and Professor Lui Tai Lok think about how to develop the Academy of Hong Kong Study and Hong Kong Study at large, we think about different ideas. At that time, I suggest that we probably need a book series, because I think that if we want to promote Hong Kong study, not just to the local community, but also to the wider international community, we need a book series to demonstrate to the peoples that what are Hong Kong study. Okay, that book series, that kinds of book represent the Hong Kong study. So 5 years ago, I think about this Hong Kong Study Reader Series, and we are very lucky to have the support of Palgrave and also CTU Press in Hong Kong to publish this bilingual series. So 5 years ago, we have already planned this so-called Hong Kong Study Reader Series. This year, we have the first book that have been published under this series, The Hong Kong Popular Culture by Dr. Kavia Wong. She later will share with us her findings in this book. And apart from this book, we also have 2 other books that probably will be published in early 2021 under this series, including the Hong Kong History and Hong Kong Society. So today we will invite the authors to share with us these 2 books as well. And apart from the Hong Kong Study Reader Series, we are very happy to see that there is upcoming another new series that is related to Hong Kong study. The name is Hong Kong Study, Humanity, Perspectives, and Global Dialogues, to be published by Brill. It was championed by Professor Stephen Ju and Professor Leung Shuk Men from Hong Kong U. We will also invite them to share with us their book series. So without further delay, I will first invite our first speaker, Dr. Carsten Shield. He will share with us his upcoming book, Hong Kong Society, to be published under the Hong Kong Study Reader Series. Carsten? Yeah.
Yes. So can you hear me?
Yes, very good.
Okay. So I want to share the screen. Let me see. Okay. So Brian, can I share the screen now?
Yes. Okay, please proceed. Thank you.
Just a moment. Okay, I see. So can you see the PowerPoint? Oh.
Yes.
It's just a moment. Okay, this one. So thank you very much for the conference organizer to kindly give us the opportunity to have this kind of book book series, and we are also very lucky to have our book project in the Hong Kong Studies Reader Series. And so our book is titled Hong Kong Society, subtitle Our Stories Beyond the Spectacle of East Meets West. Later, I will tell you why we choose this subtitle. But first of all, apart from me presenting the book today, actually one of my co-authors, Dr. Lei King-Wai, is also here. So Kent, so you can see he's waving his hand and his adorable son next to him. Okay, so actually this is a free three co-author book. Apart from me and Dr. Kenny, Professor Stephen Chiu is also one of the co-authors of this book. And actually today, because we only have limited time, I will only go through first of all the background and the motivation of this book project, and then I will very briefly talk about the contents of the book, and then I will also talk about our approaches to approach Hong Kong society, various issues about Hong Kong society, and I will select two chapters for you to preview about what we are handling about Hong Kong society. So first, background and motivation. Just like what Brian said, actually, the book series started 5 years ago, and coincidentally, our Hong Kong society book also started 5 years ago. Well, now I'm talking some stories here because 5 years ago, I just came back from Australia, just graduating from my PhD study. And then, very lucky enough, I got into Chinese University of Hong Kong Sociology Department. And in the Chinese University, actually, I met my two co-authors, Professor Stephen Chiu and Dr. Kenny. And another lucky thing is that we were assigned to teach Hong Kong society course in Chinese University. And at that time, it started our whole project because at that time, we found that we need a kind of new framework to approach Hong Kong society. And at that time, we are not just planning and designing for a whole new course, but behind this course, we also have a bigger project, this book project, trying to publish a book about Hong Kong society. And actually, for sociologists in Hong Kong, we think that actually it is a very long overdue project. So if you go to the bookshelf or go to the library to try to find the most similar book about Hong Kong society, you will be very surprised that any book which is about Hong Kong society, which is not an edited volume, which is an author volume with a proper analytical or theoretical framework, it was Professor Benjamin Learn's Perspectives on Hong Kong Society, which is published already in 1996, even before the handover. So we found that, okay, it is already very dated because it cannot capture the post-handover years. And we all know that for these 23 years of Hong Kong society, we go through different ups and downs, and there are also different new waves of social movement that we need to capture. And of course, last year is almost there is no turning back for Hong Kong society to the previous status quo. So we find that there's an urgency for us to have a new book about Hong Kong society on various new social problems and new social issues. And another reason why we have this new book project is that actually, if you go to the bookstore asking some of the shopkeepers about Hong Kong books, well, you will not be very difficult to locate some Chinese book about Hong Kong society. But a lot of times, these books about Hong Kong society requires very much local knowledge about Hong Kong. So it makes international readers very difficult to assess, to get into the field of Hong Kong studies, especially for issues about Hong Kong society. So that's why another motivation for us is that we want to have a book that is not just for local scholars or local students, but also for international readers, so that they can also grab some sense about what is happening in Hong Kong. Okay, these are the background and motivation. But as you can see, it is a very, well, to me, it is the longest book project I've ever had, even longer than my PhD project. There are reasons. Later I will tell you. So let's go through what we have in this book. So as you can see from this table of contents of this book, apart from the preface and the postscript, we have 10 other chapters. Each chapter has one visually or images about Hong Kong. So that's why we, in our subtitle of this book, we use the word spectacle, because spectacle is something that is to be displayed, to be speculated, and we find that actually there are quite a number of common or famous imagery for Hong Kong that we want to revisit. So for example, in the first chapter, we try to think about Hong Kong as a British Empire's crown jewel. So in this chapter, we try to look at the colonial history, especially we want to talk about what are the colonial legacy, okay? For the second chapter, we want to talk about Hong Kong as an international hub. And especially we want to talk about how Hong Kong's rise from fishing village into the international financial city under the modern world system. In the third chapter, we talk about Hong Kong as a migration center. Especially, we try to look at ethnic minorities in Hong Kong under the global context, because we know that Hong Kong is a global city, although it might be the second tier one according to different categories. But Hong Kong is definitely a global city, and there are a lot of ethnic minorities issues in Hong Kong. The fourth chapter, it is almost one of the chapter we must handle in the post-handover period. Hong Kong as a place of conflict over hearts and minds. It is about identity politics. So identity politics now is a very debatable and sensitive issues in Hong Kong. But if you look back to the literature, you'll find that actually a lot of the literature about Hong Kong identities are very dated. So we try to go beyond what we call the left and right or the refugee mentality issues in this chapter. For the fifth chapter, Hong Kong was always praised as an economic miracle, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And actually, we know that there are a lot of myths about laissez-faire about Hong Kong at that moment. And in this chapter, we want to look at the myth of laissez-faire and industrialization in Hong Kong. For the sixth chapter, actually, Hong Kong has another very famous imagery about culture. It is positioned as a kind of Asian Hollywood in the colonial period. So that's why in this chapter we try to look at the film industry in the golden period and after. It is also served as a case for Hong Kong's industrialization period to see how a particular industry is ups and downs in the colonial period and the post-colonial period. In the seventh chapter, we go to talk about social inequality and social mobility. So as we all know that youngsters in Hong Kong now suffers from a lot of social mobility blockage, and social inequality is widening now in Hong Kong. So that's why we try to look at Hong Kong, to try to revisit the imagery to see whether Hong Kong is still a land of opportunity. For the eighth chapter, we try to touch on something very core issue about Hong Kong. We all know that Hong Kong is a high-density living society, and also the housing price is the highest in the world. And Hong Kong is suffering is the major housing crisis that a lot of people are struggling to live in very small cubicle units. So that's why in the eighth chapter, we try to visit Hong Kong as a kind of battlefield for shelter. And in this chapter, we try to look at what we call the symbiosis of Hong Kong's housing crisis and the dual land regimes. In the ninth chapter, we try to look at Hong Kong from another perspective, from the criminological perspective, trying to see whether Hong Kong is the safest place in the world. Well, you might not know that Hong Kong actually has almost the highest highest number of policing ratio in Hong Kong in the world. And we try to look at Hong Kong from what we call the Gangland to Copland and to Disneyland. So it is quite a funny conceptualization here, because we try to look at how Hong Kong society proceed from one stage from a gang society to a police society to some of the issue about the private policing in Hong Kong. In the last chapter, it is the most important chapter we think in the whole book, and it is also the most difficult chapter we have to write, because we try to look at Hong Kong as a city of protest. And undoubtedly, over the past 5 years, Hong Kong experienced waves of social movement. So that's why in this chapter, we try to look at Hong Kong social movement, especially for the quest for democracy and freedom. It is the hardest chapter we have ever written. So that's why we use so many time trying to revise, because whenever we try to finish this chapter, a new movement is on the march. So that now in the end, we finish this chapter and we try to position ourselves under a framework of a new political opportunity structure framework. So these are the table of content. As you can see, it's structured from have 10 different social issues, and each chapter can be read as a standalone chapter. So you don't need to, of course, there are a lot of cross-referencing between chapters, but students and teachers can also use particular chapter to understand particular social issues about Hong Kong. So talking about our approach, actually we have three different approaches to talk about Hong Kong society. The first approach is what we call the standard definition image versus the high definition image. So here you can already see that we try to approach our book by using some kind of spectacle tool. For sociologists, we are always common to talk about there are a lot of common sense issues in our society, and we want to debunk it. And for this particular book, we try to see that actually there are a lot of standard definition images in Hong Kong society, just like the 10 images I just presented a moment ago. But we are not saying that these images are not correct or wrong, but they are just the standard definition. They are, in some sense, they are not precise enough. So that's why we try to approach these images to use a high definition approach. So that's why we try to give them more fine-grained analysis, trying to understand what is happening to these images. Okay, trying to provide a more detailed approach, detailed image to the readers. The second approach we try to use is the state market civil society approach. For me and Professor Stephen Chiu, we were trained in the field of political economy and also in the sociology of development. So that's why we also try to put this framework into analysis. And in different chapters, we try to see we try to understand the role of the state, the market and civil society in different social issues. And we also try to look at the ebbs and flows and the interaction of these different spheres. And of course, in the post-Hanover period, and especially these 5 years, the state is very important, and the civil society is also very important. So that's why we find this approach very appropriate to analyze the post-Hanover period. And the third approach we try to use is the multi-level analysis. We know that Hong Kong is always a global city, starting from the very beginning of its inception as a colony to the British Empire. So that's why we also need to understand different social issues about Hong Kong from different levels of analysis. So we have the local, regional, national, and global level. So later, when I presented one of the chapters about Hong Kong, you will see that why this multi-level analysis is important. So let's have some case about what we have in this book. So in the second chapter, when we talk about Hong Kong as an international hub, the rise of Hong Kong in modern world system, we have two sets of imageries we want to debunk. Okay, for the first chapter, for the first image, standard definition image, we always have some kind of narrative talking about Hong Kong, the rise of Hong Kong. Typically, reiterates the colonial narrative, portraying Hong Kong, the free trade as the key to Hong Kong's prosperity. In this chapter, trying to look at it more carefully, we will see that if you concern the role of trade in the rise of Hong Kong, we often find that the local Chinese compradors in facilitating the Sino-British trade activities in the early colonial period were often ignored. So that's why in this chapter, we spend a lot of time trying to single out what is the role of these Chinese compradors in this trade. especially for a lot of famous early tycoons in Hong Kong, and actually a lot of the opium trade or a lot of the infamous trade that they were engaging in, how to make Hong Kong rise in the trade system. The second set of the image is Hong Kong's economic success is often tied to the opportunities arising from the Cold War and its own free trade policy. So in the post-war period, Hong Kong has a special. We were often told that Hong Kong has a very special role next to China and to the Western capitalist world. But we actually this kind of imagery also ignore a very important role about Hong Kong, especially Hong Kong actually has a very prominent role in facilitating the regional north-south trade, because in this set of standard definition imagery, it's often just talk about the east and west trade, but often ignore the north and south trade between East Asia and Southeast Asia. Another chapter, in chapter 4, we talk about identity politics. Just like what I told you, actually, the identity issue in Hong Kong is always a complex issue. So as you can see from this figure, in this chapter, we try to go beyond some very common some literature about Hong Kong identity. So usually we will think about in the post-war period, Hong Kong, a lot of people are possessing some of the refugee mentality. They are a lot of our first generation Hong Kong people think themselves refugee. Okay, and another thing is that after the post-war period, we always think that Hong Kong is divided into left and right camps. For the left, it is a post-CCP. For the right is the post-Taiwan, the KMT1. But actually, we find that these imageries is not very accurate, because actually we find that local identity and national identity also proceed at the same time during different periods of time. For example, from 1995 to 1970s and 80s, actually for the local identities, yes, we find that there are what we call the populist local identity developing. But after that, especially into the 2000s, the radical local identity also emerged. At the same time, for national identity, there is a very strong sense of ideological Chinese identity starting in 1960s. And also, of course, this is a very important year that also triggered the 1967 riots in Hong Kong. After that, there is a sudden turn for an urge for the democratic Chinese identity side by side with the conservative Chinese identity. So that's why at that moment, it is a watershed for Hong Kong to have two very different camps of politics in Hong Kong. For the one is the pan-democratic camp. For another one is a very conservative post-establishment camp. And after the 2000s, we also find that there is also a sudden surge of the conservative Chinese identity from the establishment camp, and it is juxtaposed with the radical local identity. So we find that throughout these years, actually identity for local or national ones, they change from one time to another, and they were in conflict with each other. So these are the snapshot for our chapters. So that's the end for my presentation. So if you have any question, so Brian, if you have one or two questions, you can ask now.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, very well.
Yeah. Thanks, Carsten, for the great presentation. Actually, I really look forward to reading these books. Hopefully in the upcoming months. One thing I would like to ask you is that Hong Kong is a transformative society. Everything has been changing very rapidly, particularly over the past 1 or 2 years. Basically, every day when we wake up now, we don't know what will happen. Right? So my question is, how Hong Kong sociologists like you can capture such a rapid changing society? Because every day there will be very fundamental change of Hong Kong, different kinds in different areas. So how can we make sure that our theoretical framework, our empirical findings can keep pace with such a very rapid changing society?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Maybe also, Dr. Kenny, if you want to answer, you can also give some comments here. Well, my response to your question is, well, unlike historian like Jimen, they were lucky enough because they look at all things. Okay, but for sociologists, we also need to update our knowledge, especially some very rapid changes in the society. But so that's why, especially for the social movement chapter, we spend almost 2 to 3 years trying to revise our empirical findings, and also try to keep update to the most the newest change. But in the end, we sociologists try to one of our major aim is trying to identify patterns, and also some of the trends. And over the years, especially in the past 10 years, we also find there are some trends, even in some of the in the social movement issue. For example, there are new changes from the what we call in the 80s and in the 90s. We have what we call the Dai Toi. Okay, there are some big stage for they emphasize the leadership in the movement. But starting in the post handover period, there is a new way of organizing social movement. They emphasize this organization, leaderless movement, be water. Okay, these are the new trends that sociologists us can capture in our analysis. So that's why we sociologists actually still have some utilities in this area, even though we are not newspaper commentators that comment on things every day. But because we do have some kind of approach that we find useful even for applying in a very rapidly changing society.
Yeah, Ken, do you want to make some points? No. Okay. Thank you very much. I think we really look forward to reading this book, Hong Kong Society. One thing I would like to mention is that the book series, the Hong Kong Study book series, it is a bilingual series. The English version will be published by Palgrave, and we also have a Chinese version to be published by CDU Press. So probably next year we could read both the Hong Kong Society book in both English and Chinese next year. Thank you very much. Thank you, Castor.
Thank you.
So now we move to the another book by my very good friend, Dr. Kong Chi Man, The Rising Historians in Hong Kong. Is Chi Man here? Yeah.
Yes, I'm not rising anymore. Can't rise anymore.
Yeah, so when 5 years ago when I planned this book series, I think, of course, I think we need a book about Hong Kong history. So I immediately invite Chi Man to help coordinate this project. So this book is also going to compete very soon. So so I pass the time to Chi Man. He will share with us some initial findings of his book. Thank you, Chi Man.
Yes, thank you, Brian, and thanks, Carsten, for the very interesting presentation about another volume on society. The first thing I would like to say is I owe Brian a super big apology, because this is a not a very big project. It's just compiled essays by around 12 historians. But the problem is, but frankly, I would never do that again, because chasing 11 authors it can be a nightmare sometimes. But it is a very meaningful work, though. It's a very, very useful work, I hope. So basically, what I'm going to say is about an introduction of the history volume of the Hong Kong Reader series. I will have a very brief introduction about the stage of Hong Kong history studies nowadays, and give some backgrounds of the volume, and share with you the goals of the volume, what we are trying to achieve by this work, and a very brief outlook of the chapters. and maybe some pointers, basically my own view about the study of Hong Kong history in the coming few days ahead. So basically, nowadays it's actually a better period to study Hong Kong history than perhaps 2-3 decades ago, because by then there are not many audience on the topic. But nowadays, Hong Kong really gained, okay, I would use the word gained, international attention somehow in the past few years experience. So it's very good for us to really dig into the Hong Kong history from all sorts of news perspectives, and using all these interdisciplinary approaches, which were not very common among the historians working on Hong Kong history in the previous decades. So nowadays, we have lots of topics being covered by Hong Kong historians. By Hong Kong historians, I don't mean Hong Kong-born historians. I mean historians who are working on Hong Kong. So people started to look into previously overlooked fields such as gender, medicine, and so on and so on. More social history, the history of labor, cultural history, and of course identity, and so on. So it's not just about and legal history as well, which is becoming a much larger field than a decade ago. And so it's not just about wars or politics. Okay, I myself is a trained military historian, but even myself have to pay more attention to all these dimensions rather than just some hard facts about battles or decision makers. Anyway, so for Hong Kong historians, publication platform has always been a problem. So we don't have many dedicated internationally recognized journals on Hong Kong history, and university presses are willing to publish Hong Kong history related works, but not all the time. But nowadays it's a lot better, of course. But on the other hand, within Hong Kong, you have a huge demand for popular history, especially since the 2000s, really. You started to have much public interest in Hong Kong history, everything related to Hong Kong history, especially during the colonial period. And of course, you also have a rising international audience about Hong Kong history. It's not just about from the historians, but also sociologists, political scientists who might be interested in the context of what is happening nowadays in Hong Kong. And at the same time, in Hong Kong, we also have the emergence of some history education initiatives, mainly launched by, of course, the Education Bureau. Basically, it involved the placing of Hong Kong history within the secondary school history and Chinese history curriculums. So it's very strange. In Hong Kong, you have Chinese history and history being taught as separate subjects. So from this year on, secondary schools, especially the junior form secondary schools, Form 1 to Form 3, basically 12 years old to 15 years old, they will be taught about things about Hong Kong history. So you started to really have much demand, not just on serious academic studies and those cutting-edge research, but also much demand on some sort of review works, critical literature review, or overview general studies about Hong Kong history, which would allow non-specialists as well as the specialists to quickly jump into a particular topic. For example, if someone wants to know about the military history of Hong Kong, or the stage of the study of the military history of Hong Kong, but they only have 45 minutes or 1 hour to spend. So it's better to have a book chapter ready for them, rather than introducing them to my Eastern Fortress and then ask them to read in 3 days. So it's not good. So that is why we started to have this project, and thanks very much for Brian's invitation. So we started to think of, let's say we are trying to, at the very beginning, we wanted to write a full book about Hong Kong history, but but it only goes nowhere because there's so many authors and so on. So we settled with the idea of having a series of critical literature reviews on different topics about Hong Kong history, and then we will try to, in each chapter, we will try to point out the future research direction, the possibility of expanding our current knowledge in particular topics. So we collected around 12 authors. Not all of them were equally reliable, but at the end of the day, we have secured at least 10 authors. So we are waiting for 1 or 2 authors, but hopefully they will all be able to submit their chapters by the end of the year, including the leader of the project, Professor Wong Meng Kong. But he is the supervisor of the whole project, and basically he points out the direction. And so if everything goes right, which I expect it would be, the English volume would be published in 2021, and we will expect the Chinese version soon afterwards. The goal. So basically, what we are trying to achieve is not just a simple literature review, but throughout all these reviews, throughout all these chapters, let's put it this way, throughout all these chapters, they share some very fundamental points. For example, they all highlight the historical relevance of Hong Kong, international relevance of Hong Kong in history. They also all look at the colonial past, not with a very rosy scope, because some of the previous discussions were either portrayed the colonial period as one hellish experience, as one of a heavenly experience. It is just too radical in a sense. But we try to put things into international perspective. We also try to put things in Chinese history perspective, because during the period, China also experienced much historical changes, and of course, East Asia in general. So we try not to ban ourselves from a particular perspective, but we at the same time, we try to highlight the international relevance and the international importance of Hong Kong. And on the other hand, we also want to highlight the shared experience between Hong Kong with different parts of the world. Some of the phenomena that was transnational, for example, and some of the trends that were transnational, or the flow of people, flow of ideas, and so on. So we also try to, on the one hand, highlight the uniqueness of Hong Kong as a place where different culture meets, but on the other hand, we also try to highlight the shared experience between Hong Kong and other similar port cities in different parts of Asia, or even different parts of the world. So basically, that's the goal of volume. So by looking at historical issues, different historical issues from during the past 200 years or so of Hong Kong history, we try to highlight these points. So basically, that's that. So these are the chapters. We have in general around 12 chapters, supposedly. So we'll see. But what I'm going to present now are the secured chapters. So there will be 1 or 2 chapters that may or may not appear in the book. The first chapter was done by Professor Wong Meng Kong himself, which is about the changing political institution in Hong Kong. So basically, it's an overview of not just the literature on the political institutions in Hong Kong, but also a critical assessment of the issue probably from the establishment of the British rule to around maybe the end of the colonial period. So basically, that's that. So those before as a general rule for this volume, those before 1840, 1841 would not be discussed in very much detail. So basically, this volume was about the modern history of Hong Kong, and we spend almost the entire attention to the colonial period or the early years afterwards, but not much after that, because that would be the job of other volumes as far as I am concerned. The the second chapter would be about the military history of Hong Kong. Basically, it's a very general overview of the strategic and military history of Hong Kong, the international relevance of Hong Kong in terms of strategy of different empires. For example, the British Empire, the Japanese Empire, the successive Chinese governments, and so on, and of course the United States of America. So this chapter will focus on all these, and at the same time have some reviews on the literature on this topic, and of course some future directions for study, such as the possibilities of looking into the built heritage in Hong Kong that were related to the military history of Hong Kong, or using the military history of Hong Kong to highlight the diversity of the people's experience as well as the cosmopolitan background of the city's population. Because it is not just the Chinese or not just the British experience, but also of all different people from different ethnicity. For example, the Gurkhas, for example, South Asians, for example, Portuguese and Eurasians, of course. So this would be that. And the third chapter would be written by Lawrence Hall, the well-known expert, almost the only well-known expert on Hong Kong police, the history of Hong Kong police. He wrote extensively on the topic, and in this chapter he discussed the changing organization of the Hong Kong police throughout the colonial history, and probably with particular attention on the 67 riot, what happened afterwards, the emergence, the transformation of the Hong Kong police from a paramilitary force into a community policing, and so on and so on. And he may also touch upon the recent challenges and so on. And another chapter would be by Dr. Zhu Weilei, from an alumni of Baptist history, and who recently graduated from Bristol University, got his PhD from there. And he works on the Cold War history. He's now working in the Public Records Office in Hong Kong. So he's a promising young scholar, and he writes about the Cold War in Hong Kong, the British strategy for Hong Kong during the period, and decolonization. So the impact of all these on the social, not just social, but also political development of Hong Kong. And another chapter was by Dr. Lachlan Barber from the Geography Department of History of Hong Kong Baptist University. He works on the built heritage in Hong Kong. Previously he studied the built heritages in Canada, and now he works in Hong Kong, and he focused on the use of built heritage and the politics behind it, and so on and so on. So this built heritage issue became a large topic since the early 2000s, when you started to have the demolition of a series of landmark buildings that were related to the colonial period, and started all these almost like nostalgia of the British colonial rule. So this would be, on the one hand, a cultural history, and on the other hand, a history of urban planning and of course urban economies. And another chapter is by Catherine Chan, another Baptist alumni who also graduated from Bristol University for her PhD. She's now working in Macau University. So her work her works were usually about the transnational experience and the Eurasians and the Portuguese in Hong Kong and Macau. And in this chapter, she looks at the Hong Kong culture and identity with particular focus on the historical side. So it's not and it's a review of the studies as well in general. And Dr. Law is a graduate from the, I forgot. The Nanyang Polytechnic, I think, in Singapore, and he wrote about the popular culture since the 1990s. Okay, so it's on the one hand a historical overview, and on the other hand a literature review as well. So it would be something like a sister chapter with Catherine's work, I think. Yeah, and you have Dr. Lee Chun Wing, who works on the history of Hong Kong football, a very popular topic among the general public as well as some scholars. So there are some works about this, and he used this topic to look into the Cold War and identity as well as things beyond that. So usually when people studied the history of Hong Kong football, they usually focus on football, Hong Kong people's identity and so on. But Dr. Lee has something else to share. So that would be the chapter. And the last one that we have 100% secured is Dr. Lau Kai-Yu's work on Chinese martial arts in Hong Kong. He himself is very good at certain kinds of martial arts. I don't know which, but he's very strong. Anyway, so he works on the coming of the import of Chinese martial arts from different parts of China in the 20th century, and how these culture were related to the social development of Hong Kong, the emergence of the working class, and the need for the locals, and the cultural dimension of Chinese martial arts in Hong Kong. So it would be a pretty interesting chapter as well. So basically, that would be all. But we still have two more chapters. One would be about public health, the history of public health in Hong Kong during the colonial period, and the other would be about religion in Hong Kong, also during the 19th and 20th centuries. So we hope we would be able to secure these two chapters. It's very hopeful. So let's see. So for myself, I think this volume represents the view of a group of younger generation of historians who mainly work in Chinese, who mainly write in Chinese. Some of them usually write in English, one or two of them, but some of them mainly work in Chinese. And it really gives an opportunity for them to introduce their work, as well as that of the previous work, many of them also in Chinese, to the international audience. As Carsten just said in his volume, it's very important for us to introduce the works on Hong Kong studies in Chinese to the larger audience, because it's very difficult, as he said, for international scholars who are interested in Hong Kong to restart the whole process by reading all these classical works in Chinese, which may or the readers may or may not have the capability of or time of doing so. So I think the importance of this volume is mainly that. And as for the future directions for the study of Hong Kong history, to me, I think the first task for us ahead would be the need to highlight the international relevance of Hong Kong in history. So many previous work, especially those for the popular audience, would focus on the local issues or the relevance of Hong Kong in Chinese history. These are important. These are certainly important. No one would deny that. But on the other hand, I think it's also necessary to talk about the international connectedness of Hong Kong. Some of the recent works very brilliantly demonstrated that, for example, Elizabeth Sin's Pacific Crossing and so on. So this is very important. First, to highlight the international relevance of Hong Kong. The second one would be the diversity of historical experience, because many, as I repeatedly said, many previous work discuss the Hong Kong's experience from a Chinese perspective, or the local Chinese perspective, which I think is good, is important, but it's not complete, because, for example, in Hong Kong, it was and it has been and it will be an international community in Hong Kong. So you have people from around the world settled in Hong Kong and have very different historical experience, not just throughout history, but also maybe currently or in the future. So this should also be highlighted. For example, the historical experience of the Gurkhas in Hong Kong, the Japanese occupation, or the Eurasians in Hong Kong, the Portuguese communities. These are all interesting topics that would make Hong Kong somehow different from many Asian port cities, comparable Asian port cities. And of course, the need for interdisciplinary studies. We historians usually focus on narratives, but the new generation of historians can not just construct narratives, but also be able to take reference to or pay attention to other disciplines, for example, sociology, political science, or cultural studies, and so on. So we may not be able to use the theories per se, but we definitely will have to take these into our mind when we do our historical research. So it's not just about writing stories without paying attention to the context, but also the theoretical context. I think these are all important. And the last point I would like to add is the need to move beyond periodizations, because previously in Hong Kong history, in the study of Hong Kong history, we always have the pre-war, post-war, pre-1841, post-1841, all these watersheds in history. These are clearly watersheds in history, for example, 67. But on the other hand, the continuity or the highlight of continuity would be important, and that would be probably the historian's job to look at the historical continuities as well as the cuts and the differences between different periods. For example, when we talk about Hong Kong industry, we usually would talk about the 1949, the influx of capital and labor, but from historical perspective, this may not be entirely the case, because you also have the pre-war surge of light industry, and then of course the pre-war the heavy industry from the early 20th century. So all these periodizations, they are on the one hand relevant and useful, but on the other hand, when we look at the historical issues, we may have to move beyond that. So basically that's that. And if nothing goes very wrong, the book will come out in 2021, and I hope you will find the book useful. Thank you very much for your attention, and that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks a lot. I just have one question to ask you and discuss with you. Is that I think history is so important for not just historians, but also different scholars from different disciplines, political scientists, sociologists, culturalists. They may also need to adopt some form of historical perspective when doing their own research. For example, these days, when I'm doing research about Hong Kong geopolitics, of course, I need to read a lot of history archives about Hong Kong geopolitics during the Cold War, whatever. And actually, I have always asked Chairman, how can I find a State Department archive, CIA archive, or even how to do citation, okay? Because I have not done archival research before. But my question is, history is so important to Hong Kong study as a multidisciplinary area study. So in future, how you as a historian and also how your book may help Hong Kong study scholar from different disciplines to have more crossover, more collaboration, so as to bring a more in-depth historical perspective to their own disciplinary research.
I think it comes from a very practical level. It comes as a very handy book to make citations. I think the first function of the book is to help people who want to go into a topic quickly to have a quick reference for the classics of a particular topic first. And then they will also be able to, from this book, find similarities between different topics or threads across one or two more topics. For example, when we look at football, maybe sports or in general, and then it's definitely related to the chapter on Cold War, which is also related to the military history, strategic history of the chapter, and somehow it might be related to identities as well. So this book will, I hope, will help the readers, especially the researchers, who may not be Hong Kong specialists in the first place, to connect the dots, the different points about Hong Kong history, but at the same time be able to look at the larger picture, which is the international relevance of Hong Kong in the 19th and 20th century. This is on the one hand. And on the other hand, it would be an invitation for future scholars to look into Hong Kong as a case study. Well, because on the other hand, you have many scholars who were not working in Hong Kong. They may be working in Kobe or Manila or Taipei or Singapore. So when they want to do any sort of comparison, they can look at this book, they look to this book for examples or useful references or just as a pointer for further readings. So it's more like a guideline for anyone who would like a quick access to a series of historical works about Hong Kong. So that would be the purpose.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Chiman. I think I really look forward to reading this book and learning more about Hong Kong history.
We almost
very
there.
much. So we will go to the third speaker for this panel, Dr. Kavia Wong. She will speak about her book, Hong Kong Popular Culture, under this series. Actually, Kavia is previously the postdoctoral fellow of Academy of Hong Kong Study. So I remember that when she reported duty a few years ago, I immediately talked to her that we need to write a book about Hong Kong popular culture, because just like other topics, there is not much a comprehensive guide that help us to go into the field of Hong Kong popular culture. And for me, Hong Kong as a global city, one of the major dimensions is that our popular culture, television, film, Canton pop, all these things have been globalized and projected to different corners of the world over the decades. So we really need a book to let the Hong Kong people and also the international reader to know more about how Hong Kong popular culture has been globalized over the past few decades, and what is its future, something like that. So that's why we come up with the book, Hong Kong Popular Culture. It has been already been published. Okay, so if you find this book interesting after listening to Dr. Kavia Wong's presentation, you can immediately buy it. Okay, so I will pass the time to Dr. Kavia Wong, but because Kavia is now outside of Hong Kong, because of different time zones, she will join our discussion by way of a recorded video. So I pass the time to Kavia. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Greetings from New York City. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are at this moment. It is my great honor to be invited to give a book talk in this conference. And it is also a weird yet special occasion for me to meeting you all here through the screen. I hope you all are doing very well in this definitely unusual year 2020. Now I will switch my gear and share with you all the presentation slides of my book talk. See you later. This presentation is about my newly published book, Hong Kong Popular Culture, World in Film, Television, and Popular Music. My name is Kavir. I'm currently living in New York, pursuing my professional training as a film conservator and digital archivist under the sponsorship of the Hong Kong Scholarship of Excellence scheme. Before I moved to the US, I was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Academy of Hong Kong Studies. The book, Hong Kong Popular Culture, published by Palgrave, is part of the Hong Kong Studies Reader Series. Before I dive into my book, I would like to take this opportunity to express my enormous gratitude to the Academy of Hong Kong Studies. As the first postdoc research fellow at the HKS, I was provided ample academic freedom and resources to dive into my all-time research interest, Hong Kong popular culture, especially my enthusiasm in exploring the history of Hong Kong's film industry. And of course, the development of Hong Kong's film industry is never a standalone subject, but dynamically intertwining with other cultural industries. For instance, the development of Hong Kong's popular broadcasting business and the whole popular music scene. Standing on the shoulders of giants, I tried to explore over 100 years historical trajectory of the three major cultural forms in Hong Kong popular culture, namely Hong Kong film, television, and pop music. I extensively surveyed existing literatures, not only academic research publications, but also industrial reports, for example, trading statistics, and art critiques, magazines, and online resources of different kinds. I want to highlight here that non-academic publications did offer me the most food for thought. but these materials scattered everywhere, and you need to treasure hunt. Many of them, I would say, are written in Chinese. I also conducted in-depth interviews with professionals working in the industry, including senior managers from film companies, cinema chains, film directors, songwriters, cultural critics, and so on. I also spent a substantial amount of time visiting film archives and government archives in order to explore a more thorough picture of the cultural industry, especially its relation with the government and with the whole societal context. Unearthing archival records has always brought great joy to me. Time-consuming, yet rewarding. This is also why I'm pursuing a degree in the US specializing in archival studies. This book traces the evolution of the Hong Kong's popular culture, film, television, and pop music, which is also known as Cantopop. These three popular cultural sectors are knotted with the city's geopolitical, economic, and social transformations. Under various historical contingencies and due to the city's special geopolitics, these major popular cultural forms have experienced various broadening processes and have generated border-crossing impacts culturally and socially. This book, delineating from the dawn of the 20th century and following a chronological order, tackles how the nowadays popular Hong Kong film, Hong Kong television, and Cantopop are derived from early-age Sinophone cultural heritage, reshaped through cross-cultural hybridization and influenced by multiple political forces. Though this book is about Hong Kong popular culture, it is very much inspired by the theoretical framework that studies Hong Kong from a global perspective instead of treating Hong Kong merely a case study. For centuries, Hong Kong possesses a double marginal identity, geographically peripheral and culturally alienated to the Orthodox and Chinese convention. Yet, at the turn of the 20th century, Hong Kong already gave rise to a prosperous popular cultural scene, neither a copycat of Shanghai nor Beijing. Historian Elizabeth Sin, elaborated in the book Meeting Place, says that Hong Kong is, quote, a place of flow for people, goods, information, capital, objects, political ideas, social customs, religious beliefs, and much else, all shaping its evolution as a world city, end quote. If we zoom into the 19th century, Hong Kong already a hub of migration through legal and illegal activities. The emigration of cheap laborers originated from South China, set off to different parts of the world. What entailed this labor migration flux were a large variety of local and global trading activities. Elizabeth Sin again indicated that the rising of Hong Kong as a cultural trading port significantly diverted the global business trajectories from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific route, namely the Pacific crossing. Hong Kong, in this sense, represents one of the earliest regional hubs of almost everything. Departing from Hong Kong, generations of Sinophone populations sailed apart, bringing along their languages, cultural habitus, and lifestyles. Among these early immigrants, Cantonese, Hokkien, and even Hakka are the most common languages. They are the founding members of Chinatowns, and they are also the ones who planted the root of Cantonese opera and theaters on foreign lands. Here, I would also like to highlight my usage of the term Sinophone. It is derived from scholarship of Sinophone studies, which lately have been intensely debated. Chinese, to a certain extent, is a culturally and politically heavy-loaded term. Sinophone, instead, refers to a, quote, heterogeneous body of articulations related to, but not necessarily subject to, the dominant discourse of China, according to East Asian historian and professor at Harvard University, Wang Dewei. Asian Studies professor at UCLA, Shi Shumei, conceives that Sinophone is a study of Sinitic language cultures which, quote, disrupt the chain of equivalence establishes since the rise of nation-state among language, culture, ethnicity, and nationality, and explores the protein, kaleidoscopic, creative, local Sinophone texts, cultures, and practices produced in and from these margins, end quote. Generally speaking, this book is divided into 4 big chunks: introduction and epilogue, chapters about Hong Kong film, chapters about Hong Kong television, and chapters about Hong Kong popular music, aka Cantopop. Within the chunks about the popular cultural format, for example, the Hong Kong television chapters, I first delineated the development of Hong Kong's popular broadcasting industry, including milestone events and historic figures. This is the chapter you can see from the slide here, Making Hong Kong TV. Following this, I discussed how Hong Kong television connects to the world, including but not limited to, for example, mixed culture in Hong Kong's media landscape, global expansion of Hong Kong's media organizations, and the widely dissemination of Hong Kong's popular cultural products. This is the chapter Worlding Hong Kong TV. In the epilogue chapter, I traced the development of Hong Kong's cultural policy. For example, how Hong Kong's cultural policy has changed from a non-intervention or reactive principle to a more proactive approach. Here, I would like to share with you some high points which I believe make Hong Kong popular culture great and shine. Hong Kong was one of the earliest regions had direct contact with film technology. Film technology was invented in the early 1890s. Since 1897, representatives of the Lumiere Brothers Company and Thomas Edison's sailed off to exhibit films to global audience, and at the same time, they shot footage of local people's everyday life. Hong Kong was one of their destinations. The footage shot by Thomas Edison's team turns out the earliest moving image documentation of Hong Kong. This is what you are seeing on the screen. I always like telling this story to my students. The first Hong Kong film was theoretically a co-production film, invested by a foreigner and filmed by a group of Hong Kong youngsters. Benjamin Brodsky, an American-Russian, started Huamei Film Company in Hong Kong and sponsored a group of film enthusiasts to shoot Zhuangzi Si Qi, which turned out the first Hong Kong locally made film. Lai brothers, Lai Man Wai and Lai Bat Hoi, were major crew members. 10 years later, the Lai brothers established Hong Kong's first film company, the China Sun. They also founded the World Theatre on Hong Kong Island, presenting to audience films from home and abroad. Beyond Hong Kong, the China Sun also shot films in Guangzhou. In the later years, Lai Man Wai went to Shanghai to start up Lianhua Film Company. Lianhua is famous for featuring Ran Lingyu, the diva of early Chinese silent film. The founding members of Hong Kong film industry, the Lai brothers, exemplified the tale of twin city between Hong Kong and Shanghai. These two cities shared different yet equally glamorous modernity and exuberance, so does their film industries. Cultural exchange between these two places were more than common in the early 20th century. That's why The first Cantonese sound film was made in Shanghai, not Guangzhou, not Macau or Hong Kong, but Shanghai. My book has a full section about this captivating milestone. This first Cantonese sound film was produced by a film company operated by the Shaw family. The Shaw family, a name that's familiar to all of you, and an entertainment conglomerate known to global film scholars and cinephile, has already become a Hong Kong legend. Almost at the same period, another Cantonese sound film was actually produced, again, not in Hong Kong. This time it was in North America. San Francisco-based film company Grandview made a film titled Romance of the Songsters. The trend of making Cantonese films and the popularity of Cantonese culture was closely related to the globally dispersed immigrants originated from Guangdong. This also leads to the once blossoming of Chinese theaters and global distribution of Hong Kong films on foreign lands. Also, at the turn of the century, Hong Kong was one of the earliest regions in the world that started its public broadcasting services. The transmission signal was ZBW. It was year 1928. Since the early age, public broadcasting programs were transmitted in multiple languages: Cantonese, Mandarin, Suzhou dialect, and English. In the post-war era, ZBW was replaced by Radio Hong Kong, RHK. Commercial broadcasting Rediffusion landed in 1949. Rediffusion also adopted a multilingual approach, especially to meet the needs of the escalating influx of post-war southbound population. According to a government report, even until the 1970s, Rediffusion still distributed programs in not only Cantonese, but also Shuangtoulese, Santawa, Mandarin Chinese, Shanghainese, Hakka, and of course, English. By that time, Hong Kong broadcasting programs were disseminated to overseas regions where host large communities of Sinophone immigrants. Cantonese opera singers, novel narrators, music performers all enthusiastically participated in the broadcasting industry. This large variety of cultural programs, disseminated through air, constructed a sense of Hong Kong taste for local and overseas audience. Hong Kong entered the television era since the late 1960s, but it is noteworthy that despite Hong Kong people enjoyed diverse television programs, especially in the 1970s golden age, the landscape was all commercial. While people in the United Kingdom had enjoyed high-quality public service broadcasting from BBC as part of the Crown Colony, whether Hong Kong shall be granted an equal privilege was under debate. A government report called Working Party Report on the Future of Broadcasting in 1971-72 gave us some behind-the-scene anecdotes. Objection opinions were presented based on assumptions that non-commercial practice was merely in theory, and Hong Kong audience remained at a low level for choosing their programs and therefore did not display a foreseeable future for public service broadcasting. They decided that wireless television in Hong Kong should be run by commercial interest. The bright side resulted from these undisclosed controversies, ironically, is the fast-growing TVB entertainment kingdom. TVB's overseas business is ranged from Southeast Asia to European American regions. Speaking of TVB, in this very last section of my presentation, I would like to share with you all some treasures that I discovered from the New York University Special Collections. This is an archive called Asian Cinevision, which is a media organization founded in New York, Manhattan, Chinatown in 1975. This media organization ran a television station called CCTV. Interesting, huh? Which means Chinese television back then. Throughout the 1970s to 1983, CCTV broadcasted news, social, and cultural programs. Among their cultural programs, I discovered that a large proportion of the contents are Hong Kong popular culture related. CCTV imported Hong Kong films, feature reported Hong Kong performance troupes and artist tour concerts. And since 1982, TVB licensed a number of TV dramas to be broadcasted in New York City through CCTV. Here on the screens, you may see very familiar faces. I used my latest finding at the NYU archive to draw to my closing remarks, because I want to highlight that study of Hong Kong popular culture is never an ending journey, especially in terms of tracing the footprint of Hong Kong popular culture at a global scale. What I just mentioned are merely a tip of the iceberg. In the book, I elaborated a lot more historically significant, yet sometimes forgotten stories of Hong Kong popular culture. Its critical reflection of the society, dynamic interaction with global counterparts, and the glamorous staging at the world stage. Today, we are facing an unprecedentedly turbulent society. Such unsettling status, by all means, exerts rolling challenges and bafflement to the popular cultural industry, calling for more timely and dynamic scholarly research in the field. To end this presentation, I will use a modified quote derived from Professor Zhu Yuwai's book, Found in Transition. Are you dead yet? No. This is just the beginning of transition. This is the end of my presentation, and I thank you all for attending this conference. Thank you. I hope to see you all in the near future.
Thanks, Kavia, for the video. Very great presentation and overview of her book. Actually, we are very fortunate that Kavia can join our discussion for a brief period before going to sleep in her time. Is Kavia ready?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, but I cannot see you. How are you?
Can you?
Yeah.
So you cannot see me?
Yeah.
Okay, let me try. Okay. I believe the video is starting.
Yeah, very good. Yeah,
Cool.
hi,
Yeah,
how are
nice
you?
meeting you. Hi, how are you?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for joining us for a short discussions. Actually, I have some questions always bearing in my mind when thinking about Hong Kong popular culture, and also when a few years ago when we think about this book project. One of the questions is that I think Hong Kong popular culture is quite distinctive in the sense that it is a popular culture that based on the city. Okay, because as far as I know, most of the so-called popular cultural study, Japanese popular culture, American popular culture, something like that, they are basically a sovereign state-centric approach. And Hong Kong is quite unusual or special in the sense that we, as a city, we have a very strong global popular cultural networks. So my question is, how do you think that your book and Hong Kong popular cultural study in futures can interact and have dialogues with all others country-centric popular cultural study?
Okay. Yeah, I agree with you that the Hong Kong popular culture is really special in the sense that it is the only, I think it's the only place in the world that a culture is named after a city instead of a sovereign state. And another parallel case I could think about it might be just Hollywood film or Bollywood film, but not as special as Hong Kong popular culture. So I would say that to build this conversation between Hong Kong and the global and other global regions or other countries, it is to highlight that Hong Kong actually is a world city. Hong Kong itself, like Kasten and Kwang Chi-man just mentioned in the earlier presentations, Hong Kong itself is a convergence of bit different things. Hong Kong is a place that receiving culture from mainland China, from Guangdong, from Shanghai, from Beijing. At the same time, Hong Kong witnesses a large influx of cultural product from Japan, from South Korea, and also from Hollywood, like dated back to the 1930s, for example. The Cantonese opera, Guangdong Daihei, is already showing some Western characteristics. So I think this global perspective for Hong Kong popular culture can really have a very dynamic conversation with the world, with the culture, with popular cultures from different parts of the world. Yeah.
Yeah. Another question is, I think Hong Kong is special in the sense, Hong Kong popular culture is special in the sense that from day one, we not just serve the local market in Hong Kong, but we also actually we export our popular cultural products to different parts of the world. Now you are living in New York, another global city. So from your first-person observation, what is the state of Hong Kong popular cultural products now in places outside Hong Kong, and in the future, how Hong Kong popular culture could be much better promoted to the overseas market?
Yeah, I would say that Hong Kong film has a really, really huge market here in North America. Like whenever I talk to people, I say I come from Hong Kong, and many of them, especially if they are interested in film culture, they just can immediately record, oh, Chow Yun-fat, Jackie Chan, Bruce Lee. So I think Hong Kong film culture has really, really huge impact in North America, and also Hong Kong television products, especially like I just mentioned, TV dramas from TVB. People can still record different titles of TVB dramas. So I would say Hong Kong popular culture to many people, especially those speaking Chinese, like Chinese American, Hong Kong popular culture sort of give them a sense of vintage, a sense of the Eastern culture. And I would say that in the recent years, I discovered an increasing trend of Hong Kong film popularity in North America. I think it is really directly related to the social movements happened in Hong Kong. People start talking about many documentaries about social movements in Hong Kong, and people also pay a lot of attention to the news happening to social news happening in Hong Kong. So I would say that this is kind of like a very, very, very new trend of how the latest Hong Kong popular culture is now influencing the cultural scene in foreign countries. And I think this part really, really needs our continuous research. And yeah, this is quite a new phenomenon, the social movement documentaries and the latest Hong Kong films and also the latest Hong Kong popular culture. This really deserves our more efforts in this field, in this research. Yeah.
Yeah, great. This come to my related and also the final question to you. I think when we talk about the globalness of Hong Kong popular culture, one of the important agents is Hong Kong diaspora, because when we talk about how to project, export, circulate Hong Kong cultural products around the world, the overseas Hong Kongers, actually they are the most important and effective agents. And nowadays we have over probably 1 million of overseas Hong Kongers in different places. and probably maybe there may be more people living Hong Kong in the years to come. So my question is how you approach the questions of Hong Kong diaspora, their importance in the circulations of global Hong Kong popular culture, and how your book may help influence this process. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, this is a really big question. Yeah, I'm also paying a lot of attention to the ever growing Hong Kong diaspora community in like especially in North America. I would say that maybe social media is a really important platform for people to circulate news, and I have noticed that there are some very small scale screening activities in different cities or maybe in different campuses happening in the recent years. So I think this kind of very decentralized form of distributing Hong Kong popular culture really needs our needs our attention to do audience study or to do more how to say, like in-depth interviews with people who join these activities and how they feel about Hong Kong and how they feel about the popular culture. But I really do not have a clear answer to this, and this is kind of like a very dynamic, ongoing trend in the recent years. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Kavya. So happy to see you.
Me too.
Because of time limitation, we have to stop here. Thanks for joining us, and hopefully we will have dialogue in person very soon. I hope so.
Yeah,
After
thank you for the questions.
The pandemic. Okay, now we come to the final speaker, Dr. Leung Shuk Man. Because I also invite Shuk Man because they just have a new book series, Hong Kong Study, Global Perspective and Dialogues. It is completely a new series. So I think it is also good to provide a platform for Shuk Man to introduce to all the friends what is the rationale and also the upcoming future plan of the book series. May I pass the time to Shuk Man? Are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes,
Can you hear me, Brian?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And Connie helping me to share the screen.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So, okay,
Yeah,
thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. So,
Thank you.
good morning. I'm Shuk Man Leung from Hong Kong Study at Hong Kong U. First of all, thanks Professor Da Lok Lui and Dr. Brian Fong inviting me to present this book series. It's indeed a great honor to participate in this conference. So this book series titled Hong Kong Studies, Humanities, Perspective and Global Dialogues is published by Brill recently. And also thanks Brill editor for making this possible. So next page. Okay, thank you. So the book series edited by Professor Stephen Yu Wai Ju and myself. So as Dr. Wong just cited Professor Ju's research, Professor Ju is the founding professor and director of the Hong Kong Study Program at Hong Kong U. His research interests focus on Hong Kong cultures, post-colonialism, and globalizations. Also, Professor Ju has published widely on the topic related to Hong Kong study, including, among others, the two books Lost in Transitions, Hong Kong Cultures in the Age of China, and Found in Transitions, Hong Kong Study in the Age of China. And for me, my specializations lie in the fields of modern and contemporary China literatures, Hong Kong literatures, and print cultures in the Chinese-speaking world. And currently, I'm working on the communist influence on Hong Kong literatures and print medias. So, as Brian just said, so we totally agree with him. It's important for us to show the general public and academics what Hong Kong study is. So, next page. Next page, please. Okay, thank you. So we both believe that the book series will act as a much-needed platform to develop Hong Kong study as an academic discipline by serving specifically as a vehicle for research in humanity fields, especially cultures, literatures, and history. Today, there is a strong interest in area study around the world. Hong Kong's unique history as a city-state, a region's British colony, SAR, and a numinous space in the old and new versions of the Cold War make it an important field of study. In short, the first core target field of our book series is Hong Kong cultures, literatures, and history. The second core target field of our book series is China studies. While we believe that Hong Kong study is a valid field of area study in its own right, we also think that it is impossible today to treat Hong Kong as a separate topic, completely detached from the field of China study. We take an approach to the study of Hong Kong that can be summed up in the phrase, Hong Kong study as method, emphasizing the many ways of cultural transitions demonstrated in Hong Kong's specific experience during its changing relationship to both the world and China. And next page, please. Okay, thank you very much. I hope to show you the editorial board member here. So you can see that we have an interdisciplinary and international editorial board. And we think that international collaborations is the main trend in academic research around the world, of course. And this is exactly what Hong Kong has been doing successfully. The editorial board members, you can see, come from UK and Taiwan and USA, Japan, and mainland China, and of course from Hong Kong. So we would like to express our gratitude to all of them for their support and advice on this project. And with the help and guidance of this editorial board member, mindful of promoting originals high-quality scholarship in Hong Kong study, we aim to make important research available to the broadest possible audience. Initially, we will limit contribution to those written in English. We also plan to publish English translations of master's piece of Hong Kong study written in other languages, mainly Chinese. Okay, next page, please. Thank you. So, as you just heard the book talk on Hong Kong Study Reader Series, so actually building on Dr. Brian Fong, Professor Dai Lok Lui, and Professor Stephen Chiu contributions to the Hong Kong Study Reader Series, which is a set of Chinese-English bilingual guides that provide accessible introduction to Hong Kong society, history, media, politics, and popular cultures. Our book series is designed to focus on publishing research on humanities, and exhibitions are global academic dialogue with China and Asian study, which I just mentioned. Further, Hong Kong plays an active role in other related disciplines, particularly post-colonial study, Cold War study, and globalizations. Study on Hong Kong will attract scholars working in the field of post-colonialism. As a former colony, Hong Kong has its uniqueness. This is so not only because of the in-betweenness of its identities, as Ray Charles highlights, but also its collaborative colonialism with Hong Kong's Chinese society, as Winston Law suggests. In addition, Hong Kong's unique experience and the Cold War context further illustrate the distinctiveness of the localities, which serves as a luminous space for coexistence of different ideologies, questioning the traditional Cold War discourse between communism and capitalism. In the present moment, when Hong Kong is under international spotlight, it's clear that the city remains on the frontiers of not only of the globalizations, but also of the old and new versions of Cold War as well. So now that the idea of the old new Cold War and globalizations have become commonplace, there is a pressing need for this book series on Hong Kong studies. It will draw scholarly attention to the uniqueness of Hong Kong perspective and of Hong Kong role in the transborder, transcultures, and trans-ideological interactions between the localities and the world. In defining and redefining the discourse of Cold War and the narrative of globalizations, Hong Kong perspectives are as important as the US-European perspective. They have the further advantages of advancing our understanding of the studies of post-colonialism, the Cold Wars, and the globalizations. So in this sense, our book series can and will continue to shed light on the social challenges that confront the world today, with far-reaching and advancements of knowledge and theoretical implications for related areas. And next page, please. Thank you. So at the end, I just want to show you different academic units of Hong Kong studies. So you will know the developments of Hong Kong study at this moment. And I also hope to have your support on our book series. So new Hong Kong study related academic units are appearing around the world. In Hong Kong itself, the Hong Kong study program in the HKU established in 2013 is the first program to offer undergraduate and postgraduate curricula. And the Education Universities of Hong Kong found the first Academy of Hong Kong Study in 2015, which focused more on research and survey. And Hong Kong Baptist University offer an associate degree program in history and Hong Kong studies. So we can see the blue icon. Leading students to explore historical, social, and cultural issues in Hong Kong, China, and the world. And on the upper one, we can see in Canada, the UBC launched a Hong Kong Study Initiative in 2017 that's promotion and research on Hong Kong. And also you can see University of Bristol has established a Hong Kong history project offering undergraduate, postgraduate scholar opportunity to explore Hong Kong's own cultural historical place at the edge of Chinese and British empires. So in addition, so you can see the middle one, the Society for Hong Kong Study, with about 200 members worldwide in its first year, was founded in 2017 as a global platform for the multidisciplinary and interinstitutional study of Hong Kong. So, given that Hong Kong study is a growing field, our forthcoming publications are hoped to attract interest from both academics and the general public. We look forward to receiving your submissions. Briefly, this series welcomes contributions from various academic fields dealing with theoretical and empirical issues relating to Hong Kong, including language, literature, histories, cinema, art, theater, post-colonial study, globalizations, Cold War studies, among others. So, this series also serves as an important venue for research of both established and young scholars, tracking the trends that will affect Hong Kong over the coming decades from humanities perspective. So, together with the above-mentioned academic unit in Hong Kong study, our series hope to promote a Hong Kong-oriented research and learning environment and thus bring Hong Kong study to a privileged place that offers theoretical insight and knowledge to other related fields of study. So this is our brief introductions on our book series. So this is the end of my presentation. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Sukman. Perhaps we can discuss for one or two questions. Yeah.
Okay.
My question is, you have a very good new series. What if any young scholar, for example, they want to contribute to your series? What they can do to approach you, and what kind of topic or theme, whatever that you are expecting to receive in terms of book proposal, something like that?
Yes, thanks, Brian, for your questions and giving me this opportunity to clarify more. Actually, we are now calling for proposals. Some young scholar and also some established scholar can approach us by our email, of course. And of course, I just paste our web page. If possible, Connie, maybe you can help us to click the web page, but it is also fine because it's very easy to search the forthcoming book series in Brill websites. So just send email to me or Professor Juice, and of course you can send email to the Brill editors. And actually currently we are looking for the proposal in the field of Hong Kong literatures particularly, and also Hong Kong cinema. Yeah, and focus on the humanities perspective to understanding Hong Kong cultures. And And you can see I just mentioned a few keywords, or you keep hearing a few keywords, the post-colonialisms, Cold War studies, globalizations. So actually, I think these are the main thematical research is the three core ideas that Professor Juice and myself are currently working on. So we want to see how Hong Kong as a special case in post-colonial studies. And for me, I'm working on Hong Kong Cold War literatures. I would like to see how Hong Kong also become a very unique case in the history of Cold War. So I think we are particularly interested in the proposal working on literatures, cinema, and art. Of course, the three main key terms that I just mentioned, and we think Hong Kong specific experience can have many theoretical implications on post-colonialisms.
Yeah, thanks, Sukman. I think it is very good to see more and more book series actually about Hong Kong study, because it reflects that we Hong Kong study scholar, the Hong Kong study community is keep expanding, and we have more and more deliverables in the years to come. So I think today is the starting point for discussion in future. I think the Hong Kong Study Reader Series and Shukman's series, we can have more dialogues and more interaction and collaborations, so as to together we can join hands to stimulate the Hong Kong study. Thanks very much. I think time is running up. We need to stop here for these sections, but we immediately will move to another section. Please wait for a moment.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. We come back for another section. This section is also a book talk about one country, two system, because we it has already it's used always a good topic to discuss one country, two system. And today we have Professor Anthony Cheung and Professor Loi Tai Lok. They have just published books or going to publish book about one country, two system. For me, it is a very special panel because Professor Cheung is my teacher. Professor Loi Tai Lok is my boss. We have met for more than 10 years, but it should be the first time that we three are on the same panel as far as I remember. So we are very happy to have a dialogue today about this very important one country, two system topic. So first of all, I will pass the time to Professor Anthony Cheung. He is going to publish a book along the theme of Hong Kong exceptionalism very soon. So this time he will first introduce to us his initial findings, initial thoughts about the past, present, and futures of one country, two system. So without further delay, I pass the time to Professor Anthony Cheung. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and good morning from Hong Kong. Actually, my book is not yet out. It's aimed for the first half of next year. And my book originally was not aimed at just talking about one country, two systems. It was really a recollection of 5 decades of what I would describe as the Hong Kong political experience, and 5 decades of governance, reforms, the dilemma in public administration. But of course, one country, two systems is a very important part of that 5 decades of Hong Kong's history. And I would like to focus on the theme, which is also part of the title of the book, Can Hong Kong Exceptionalism Last? Okay. Oh, sorry. Now, there are many ways of defining exceptionalism. You have American exceptionalism, European exceptionalism, Japanese exceptionalism. So I'm not going into that academic debate here, but I would simply look at Hong Kong exceptionalism in the sense that Hong Kong is exceptional because of its unique historical path. It was born as a British outpost from a borrowed time, borrowed place, left to its own imagination and local formula of growth, quite distinct from the Anglo-Saxon system towards economic and social prosperity since the 1980s, and then becoming an SAR of China with a different political and social system from its motherland. So to that extent, Hong Kong has been quite exceptional against various criteria. Hong Kong has also long been an East-West geopolitical and cultural space, and was described by Chen Kunzhong as the city of hybridity. Now we can examine further the Hong Kong exceptionalism from 3 perspectives. In terms of politics, governance, it has transited from an atypical colony of Britain to a SAR of China. Now, that kind of transition is important because Hong Kong has undergone colonial enlightenment and bureaucratic reformism since the 1970s. And until the late 1990s, Hong Kong was an unconventional case of bold reform of the bureaucracy by bureaucratic modernizers. And Hong Kong has been a pioneer in public sector reform in the 1980s and 1990s. As an SAR, Hong Kong has been moving forward between local autonomy and central authority under one country, two systems, and between executive government and various institutional checks and balances to strike a delicate balance in the form of durable governance, which is part of my discussion in the book, amid various constraints and until most recently, until basically 2019. which is a major turning point. The end of colonial status had meant an unavoidable degree of deinstitutionalization, but new institutions with clear functional logics have yet to be groomed. And such messy context and ambivalent identity of Hong Kong are fundamental to the exploration of the dilemmas of governance in Hong Kong. Now, in terms of economics, the classical economists like to describe Hong Kong as small government, almost classical laissez-faire. But that is, in my view, a myth, because in practice, Hong Kong, at least since the 1970s, has been practicing what was then described as positive non-interventionism, which basically means interventionism when necessary. And later on, particularly after 1997, a kind of proactive government, from a rather reactive intervention to proactive intervention. Hong Kong is also exceptional because it's part, although it is part of the East Asian economic miracle, one of the four little dragons of East Asia, but it is an outlier and an exception from the state developmental path pursued by the other members of that four little dragons, Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore. And so this is another aspect of Hong Kong exceptionalism. Culturally, and I'm quoting from others because I'm not a cultural expert per se, Hong Kong was described as a cultural fault line in a shaky geographical terrain, a translation space between Chineseness and Westernness, a cultural hub that joins vernacular culture with cosmopolitanism, and so on and so forth. All cities rise and fall in history. So the question is, can Hong Kong exceptionalism last? Will Hong Kong ultimately diminish to become just another Venice or Florence? And just what is represented by Hong Kong that we seek to preserve? This is part of the historical dilemma that needs to be tackled in any serious discourse about the city. Because we are focusing on one country, two systems here, so let's begin with the 1997 settlement, which is a kind of historical compromise and perhaps the second best solution for all parties concerned. In terms of Britain, it had preferred to continue its administration of Hong Kong, but was pleased to settle with a separate system for Hong Kong with strong British institutional features and still closely connected to the West. For China, it resumed sovereign control over Hong Kong, but was prepared to grant it a highly autonomous, somewhat subnational status, with its status quo extended so that a smooth transition can be facilitated. And Hong Kong's continued growth of capitalism would serve China's newly started reform and opening up. And it accords with the long-term logic of utilizing Hong Kong's special status. So it's both pragmatic and instrumental in that sense. For the Hong Kong community at large, they probably at that time would have preferred no change at all, but were supportive of one country, two systems for its preservation elements and promise of self-administration under a high degree of autonomy. Here's funny. Sorry. But democracy, in a way, was not part of that settlement. It was an unsettled issue to be left to more discussion and negotiation after 1997. And that paved the seeds for subsequent uncertainty and conflict. Now, the decades, more than 2 decades since 1997, in a way, have provided a test of Hong Kong exceptionalism under one country, two systems. What we have seen are clashes and incompatibilities and intensification of two systems tensions and conflicts. After 1997, as all sides began to ponder and look forward, gaps between reality and expectations and problems of institutional incompatibility began to be exposed and enlarged. The logic of self-administration has spurred a steady quest for democracy, which Beijing is not prepared to accede to fully. Beijing has never been favorable to democracy for various reasons. After the failure of Article 23 legislation and the governance crisis in 2003, Beijing began to feel Hong Kong was not patriotic enough, and its policy towards Hong Kong was adjusted from being hands-off to increasingly monitoring Hong Kong's development. When clashes occur over issues of democracy, central-local relations, and so-called core values, many Hong Kong people would feel being let down and disillusioned, particularly the younger generation who were not part of that period of historical compromise. Tensions arise between rising Hong Kong localism and equally escalating Chinese nationalism on the mainland. The 2014 Occupy Central confrontations alerted Beijing that Hong Kong might turn into a rebellious outlier. The 2019 to 2020 political upheaval and standoff has confirmed the worst in the eyes of Beijing's decision makers. Relations have moved from mutual acceptance or tolerance to mutual distrust. Hong Kong's loyalty is being questioned. Beijing concluded that it cannot just leave Hong Kong alone, but has to integrate the city more closely into a national system that over the past decade has gained a new self-confidence under the notion of China Renaissance. Hong Kong's relevance to China's growth is minimizing when its GDP has sharply declined to less than 3% of China's GDP compared to a peak of some 20% before the handover. Meanwhile, international geopolitics have changed. China's rapid rise in global power and assertiveness, accompanied by the display of stronger doses of party-state authoritarianism, is widely perceived by the Western world as a major threat to international order. So against that background, Hong Kong has been made a focal point of contentions. In 2019 and 2020, in a way, are the dividing line of Hong Kong's practice of one country, two systems. There have been miscalculations on all sides, and Hong Kong is now bearing the brunt of the serious backlash or backfire. By seeking to take Hong Kong out of the China orbit, which is what is perceived by Beijing, the US and some Western powers have struck on the most sensitive element that would guarantee strong reaction from Beijing. In the final showdown, Beijing has imposed a harsh national security law on Hong Kong and set out to tame Hong Kong and remake its political order. The Democrats, which had played its opposition role relatively well since the 1990s, another feature of one country, two systems, have now lost their role in what Beijing would prefer as constructive opposition. We are seeing the beginning of a political withdrawal syndrome. However, the pro-establishment camp cannot replace the pan-democrats as an opposition in Hong Kong's exceptional form of politics. Hong Kong has entered a phase of weak state in terms of moral authority, in terms of legitimacy, weak society, and weak politics. The US strike this year, treating Hong Kong as if one country, one system, would reduce its role over Hong Kong's future. The city has become the first battleground of the new Cold War between the US and China. Meanwhile, US and Western sanctions are dampening Hong Kong's international importance under one country, two systems. And this is a kind of, in my view, false logic of destroying a village in order to save it. Now, this slide summarizes the very different situations, different contexts for one country, two system in different eras between the 1980s, when the idea of one country, two systems was formulated, and now. And you can see that we are talking about different generations of Hong Kong people. In terms of identity, in the 1980s, most Chinese residents in Hong Kong would regard China as the motherland, although they were still suspicious of the Communist Party. But today, the younger generation, they are more assertive in local identity. In terms of economics, back in the 1980s, China was highly regarded by the mainland as an economic city, or possibly a role model for Chinese modernization. But today, China has already found its own different path of modernization. And Hong Kong's economic performance has been overshadowed by rising cities in the region, including the mainland. In terms of politics, in the 1980s, people here were generally regarded as rather politically apathetic. But nowadays, Hong Kong is a highly mobilized polity, even a political city in the eyes of some people in Beijing. In terms of Hong Kong's institutions, which form part of Hong Kong's strength, in the 80s, there was a strong, broad consensus to keep those institutions vibrant. But today, there's a growing worry that these institutions are being eroded. In terms of Beijing's attitude, in the 80s, Beijing had never doubted Hong Kong's loyalty when we turned to the motherland. But today, Hong Kong's loyalty is being questioned, as I mentioned earlier. In terms of international reaction, until the 1980s, when the Basic Law was finalized, the Western world, led by the US, the UK, was rather positive about one country, two systems. But today, of course, we know that the Western reaction has been rather negative. And President Trump even said that there's no longer one country, two systems in Hong Kong, hence the US sanctions. The emphasis of one country, two systems back in the 1980s and 90s was that of separateness, well water versus the river water, in terms of how Beijing articulated the uniqueness of one country, two systems. Today, the emphasis is on integration. So we can see the impact of different circumstances and eras on the understanding and practice of one country, two systems. Back then, one country, two systems was more shaped by the past, because the importance was to extend the status quo, continuity. Today, it is more shaped by the future. And in Hong Kong, in order to gain more space and flexibility under one country, two systems, Hong Kong has to really ask, what is the value of Hong Kong? What are those elements that make Hong Kong still so special and should be granted an exceptional status by the central government in China? So what next? All kinds of negative, pessimistic, almost doomsday theses abound. But I think most of the worries and predictions are partly, if not fully, premised on a fatalistic view of the future of China. But political or rhetorical reductionism of simplifying complexities, conundrums, and contentions into inherent wrongs and evils of the CCP-ruled state will not help ordinary people in Hong Kong to gain confidence. It would only amplify despair and fear. Of course, I'm not arguing that Hong Kong is not part of China's fate, so to speak. But one needs a historical perspective in order to understand why and how China has evolved to today's form, and then to conjecture how it might develop and transform in future. And we have to take power politics practically. Unavoidably, Hong Kong as an SAR would be constrained and to an extent shaped by China's evolving reality. But the actual outcome is not fully predetermined, but would depend very much on how Hong Kong could strategically play its part of exceptionalism well under one country, two systems, and also how China develops in future. Instead of reaching fatalistic conclusions based on what Hong Kong is not and cannot do constitutionally, I think it serves better to look for what Hong Kong can do and should do in order to sustain its vibrancy and resilience in practical circumstances within a changing China. One country, two systems has resulted in two identities and even two existentialisms within a constitutionally united nation. Hong Kong's exceptionalism could be construed or perceived as both a force and a threat. A force in that it has given Hong Kong people and whoever in government the space and opportunity not seen in a conventional colonial regime before 1997 or a typical subordinate government of a unitary state afterwards. And a threat because there is indeed no standard or clear modus operandi to be relied upon as Hong Kong evolves in given circumstances, hence demanding much political wisdom to exploit a blurred or fuzzy rather than well-defined boundary. It hinges not just on the formal institutional arrangements and historical inheritance, but also the statecraft and art of administration of the day. Exceptionalism brings opportunity, of course, but it comes hand in hand with dilemmas. More animosities are bred due to clashes in institutional practices, cultural expressions, and politics. When the locals in Hong Kong fear losing a high degree of autonomy as promised, Beijing fears having only regained possession of a Hong Kong in name. Many Hong Kongers, explicitly or implicitly, see democracy as instrumental to withstanding the mainland's intrusion. Hence their growing despair about democratic deadlock. And some even intend autonomy to mean the total exclusion of any central government role in Hong Kong's governance, which is unrealistic. We need engagement. On the other hand, an economically stronger mainland would be tempted to play down the importance and vitality of Hong Kong and to respond to anti-China expressions and acts with harsher assertions of central authority. So the danger to Hong Kong's exceptionalism lies in polarizing positioning and head-on confrontation, which leads to a zero-sum game. This is a far cry from the early days of reunification when Hong Kong was held up as the jewel of the crown, given its economic success and more advanced civil order. Both politics and economics are working to Hong Kong's disadvantage. But it does not need to mean the end of Hong Kong, as some international media and commentators push us to believe. Will there be just a recalibration of one country, two systems, or a retreat of that great formula? Different assumptions and faiths will drive different expectations and predictions. In my view, one country, two systems will continue and likely straddle 2047, but within new parameters and boundaries, a kind of one country, two systems 2.0 version. Beijing still needs a Hong Kong that is closer to the West and the institution and the international arena than other mainland cities, but only as China's Hong Kong. Shanghai and Shenzhen cannot replace Hong Kong because they are part of the mainland system. But Hong Kong has to rediscover its value to justify and earn its exceptionalism. The exercise of autonomy is subject to more central guidance. Hong Kong's essential freedoms, civil rights, and the rule of law will continue, though to be constrained by Beijing's policy, depending on its confidence and trust in the city, and under the shadow of the new national security law. Democratization will slow down. The best that can be hoped for now is a partial democracy where an opposition can still play a role, but still it depends on interactions among various players of this political contest. So the final question before I end my presentation, can Hong Kong exceptionalism last? Of course, I don't have the crystal ball before me. And in my book, I try to outline the factors, internal and external. But the answer, in my view, hinges on how Hong Kong can assure Beijing that the SAR would not become a political threat or burden to the national system, but instead deliver stable and effective governance, different from and yet complementary to the mainland system. Otherwise, there would be no strong incentive for China to keep Hong Kong exceptional. But good governance does not come out of national security law. So the other important question is when Beijing would feel less insecure, such that it would begin to encourage some necessary reforms to improve the SAR's governance and standing in order to enable one country, two systems to last long. The times that we are now in are times of uncertainty and volatility, of despair to some and of hope to others for change. The substance of Hong Kong's exceptionalism will not stay stagnant. Whether or not it will be as vigorous and impactful as before and sustainable is the major litmus test of China's one country, two systems mega project. And this is the big question before us, not just as a question for academic, intellectual curiosity, but it is so important to the life of people in Hong Kong and the importance of Hong Kong in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Zhang, for very inspiring observation about Hong Kong one country, two system. Now, I pass the time to Professor Lui Dialogue. He has just published this Chinese book, Embarrassment. In Chinese, is Gam Gai, talking about the past, present, and futures of one country, two system. So I pass the time to Dialogue, and then after that, we can have some discussions. Dialogue.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Yes, I'm going to give a short presentation upon the basis of a book I've published, I think something like 4 or 5 months earlier. But I won't get into the details of the book, but rather I would like to tease out a few new points upon the basis of my discussion in that book. And the title of my presentation is It Won't Be Yesterday Once More. So giving you a kind of strong anti-nostalgic message. The thing for me, it's if you're really serious about one country, two system, the real challenge is how to look ahead, how to look into the future, rather than just grumbling about whether we still have one country, two system or not. And in case you don't know, that Yesterday Once More was the title of a song sung by Karen Carpenter. Not my favorite singer, not my favorite song as well. I mean, I never liked the Carpenters. But rather that, it's, as I said, the strong nostalgic message. Yeah, this is the book I produced. I was told that it's kind of embarrassing in two senses. One is the title of the book and the design of the cover. Probably meaning that a lot of people don't like it, but doesn't really matter. I mean, probably it gives a very strong message about the thing that I discuss in the book is not exactly about embarrassment. Is more about parody, you may say. I talk about 10 things that how Hong Kong's one country, two system work out in a way that originally we thought about one thing, but it turned out to be otherwise. Many of them would be quite contradictory or contentious, and so on. But the most important things, I hope that I would be able to get the following messages across in the book, for some of the implications of the discussion in the book. One of the points that I want to make is about, at the very beginning, of course, it was a compromise. It was an attempt to preserve the status quo, as mentioned earlier by Anthony, that, it's a compromise or the second best solution arrived by different parties, different interests. But somehow preserving the status quo at that time seems to be able to accommodate the expectations of different parties. But the emphasis, the strong emphasis on preserving the status quo, gradually, I tend to think that it developed into a kind of psychological resistance, or sometimes even a fear to change. One of the terms that we have heard of in the past 22 years or so, repeatedly, it would be about 行之有效, something that we have practiced for very long, and then it has been practical and been doing well, then why we need to change it. A lot of things that we make reference to pre or 1997 situation and think that, it can be done at that time, so that's all right. And so why you need to take a thorough look into what's happening in our own system. And I do think that we paid the price for not really looking into the details about problems and things that we need to fix within the system itself. And closely related to that is a kind of attitude that I don't think that we have been forward-looking enough, partly because everyone is talking about preserving the status quo. Also, we don't have a lot of anticipatory power in the analysis of designing the one country, two system, or thinking about what's going to happen after 1997. Of course, sometimes you can't blame everyone. I mean, who can tell what happened to China at the time of the 1980s? Between 1980s and the current situation, China has experienced sea change. The changes were enormous. I mean, even in the early 90s, it's very, very difficult for you to anticipate what would happen next. But the problem I raised the point again, is not saying that, how come you people have not thought about that in the 80s? The problem I raise is that we don't even bother to be more forward-looking, even around the year 2000, even around the year 2003. I mean, if you look at problems about regional integration, we don't even bother to look into the details in 2005, when you understand that, changes in China is really, really powerful. And not only that it's changing the country, but it was going to have an impact on Hong Kong. But we never bothered to look ahead and be forward looking. And then the third issue is that, or the implications of my discussion in the book is, it's very interesting that, even up to now, we still have a very narrow understanding of what originally we meant two systems. One country, two systems refers to the tensions between capitalism and socialism. Of course, both capitalism and socialism evolved. But at the same time, we haven't paid much attention to how these two competing or coexisting economic systems are going to work or interact. For a long time, Hong Kong simply assumed that because we have market capitalism. So the market mechanism itself, capitalism itself, would work as a kind of partition, some kind of a 屏障, it's going to shelve us from some of the potential interventions from socialist mainland. But of course, the paradox is that, increasingly you can feel that mainland's economic interests exactly, able to impact on Hong Kong and reshape Hong Kong exactly via market mechanism. It's the buying power, it's the power of acquisition, it's the power of regional integration, it's the power of flow of capital and flow of people and so on and so forth. It's not out of the market mechanism, but rather through market mechanism. So what are the preparations that Hong Kong really need to work on, or to understand, how this interflow of capital, people, and resources would shape our future? This is something that we really need to look ahead and see how we're going to cope with it. The fourth point I would like to make is, and it actually a point that I begin to have a stronger feeling that, after publishing the book, because I've received quite a lot of comments and criticisms of the book by saying that what you have written is a load of crap, because there's only one single reason that make Hong Kong into all kinds of trouble. For one side is saying, okay, it's because of Beijing. On the other side is because of the processes. One of the funny things that in the past 2 years that you notice is the society itself is becoming polarized, divided, and people of different political spectrum on the two extremes, what they have done is pointing fingers on the others and said, that's the only reason of why things don't work anymore, without really take a good look at Hong Kong and see, what are the issues, what are the things that we need to fix. And this leads to the fifth point that I want to make, is that is probably the most important message of my book is, few of us actually bother to think about the questions about how to manage one country, two systems. It's a system that needs good management. We need to have that kind of managerial instinct, knowing that, issues may come up. And so it's not a matter of principle that you say yes or no, but rather how. For example, questions like regional integration, questions like inbound tourism. These are issues that if we pay more attention to management, the effect or impact would be very, very different. It may be a good idea, but it turned out to be very negative. So why? But these are the points that I hope I was able to raise them in my book and to convince you that, probably they are important messages. But then, of course, as I said, I'm not interested in being nostalgic. One of the strong points that I always want to push is keep saying that, don't make pre-1997 Hong Kong some kind of, time capsule. Whatever there's a problem that you refer back and, the good old days wouldn't have that kind of problem and so on and so forth. So we need to look at the current situation, and then we need to look ahead. Hong Kong in 2020, of course, is a very, very tough year. And we have to admit that the political parameters have been redefined. Some people would think that it's no big deal, but there are big challenges. I would think that, it will also bring new problems and new controversies as well. And I'm personally don't think that, all these changes are happy changes. But at the same time, we need to recognize the very fact that, we have political parameters. And a lot of these lines in defining parameters, they are not new. For example, the question of sovereignty has always been a matter of very seriousness. Anthony and I probably belong to the cohort that have gone through the entire Sino-British negotiation, the 1997 and so on. So we have a lot of memories about whenever you touch on the question of sovereignty, you end up with a very strong reaction from Beijing. So for example, related to the Hong Kong's future discussion, as early as MacLeod's visit to Beijing, raising the issues that perhaps instead of saying, the treaty, the lease of new territories would expire on the first day of July in 1997, why not we just cross out the date, but rather put down as long as the British administration is still effective. That was his approach, and that was his proposal brought forward to Deng Xiaoping when they met in that visit. And right away, Deng Xiaoping said, no, this will not be entertained. Of course, in the archive nowadays, we have a chance to read them and understand that even for MacLeod, they're not quite sure if Deng Xiaoping really knows what he's talking about. But we all understand that, when you touch on that issue, the reaction will always be there. Same thing about the discussions about Hong Kong's future concerning whether the People's Liberation Army will be stationed in Hong Kong or otherwise. Again, as a symbol of sovereignty, it was a serious matter. So there are always lines, there are always perimeters that, these are frameworks that probably you can't surpass. But having said that, doesn't mean that, the redefinition of political parameters, as I said, are all well handled. And in fact, I do think that, in certain ways, a lot of things in the past 2 years, if there's a chance to really to look at the issues again, we do need to learn how to approach the same issues in a far better way. The reason I raise that issue is because at the end of the day, when we are serious about one country, two systems, one of the things that we need to think about is the institutional framework of one country, two systems. The essence of one country, two systems, of course, covered sovereignty, cover relative autonomy, but at the same time, it also a kind of understanding or spirit that emphasizes a lot on dealing with issues, solving issues within an institutional framework according to certain norms. So we fully understand that, there's always tension between whether you have power or authority to do certain things. But on the other hand, you also understand that even though that you have the power and authority, perhaps it would also be nice or good or sensible and reasonable to realize that power through the proper procedures. And this is the reason why we talk about institutional framework. I think in the past 2 years, one of the major issues that's been fully exposed in front of us is there are cracks and there are cleavages and there are inadequacies in the way that we deal with institutionalization of political conflict. Conflicts are inevitable. But for us, the real challenge is how are you going to resolve conflicts within the institutional procedures? Would there be other ways so that you can convince the people that even though that you're not fully happy with the results, but at least these are the right steps to follow, including that I think in the past 1 or 2 years, we've heard a lot of people saying that, this is a political matter, you deal with it politically. So you resolve differences according to certain rules. And this is one of the challenges, I think, in front of us. How are we going to rebuild the political stage? And by political stage, I'm not just talking about the SAR government. It's also talking about the role of the opposition, the role of different parties, the role of different interests through the political arena. So ideally, it's not the questions that whether certain parties have the power to do certain things, but rather you would think about the right extent of restraint, not just from one side, but on both sides, in how to handle differences. In the process of dealing with differences, it's not just about whether we arrive at a conclusion or whether you would get your proposal adopted, but rather get it done in the proper way, in a way that people would find it acceptable. As I said, we need to look ahead and look into the future. And so inevitably, the questions about the end of Hong Kong would pop up. It pops up in Anthony's PPT and pops up in my own PPT as well. And I'm sure that sooner or later, this title would pop up in one of the popular magazines in Chinese or in English and talks about Hong Kong's future again. I tend to think that, it's a kind of cliche, it's a kind of cliched expressions of Hong Kong's future. Because most of the time, people would not be very exact about what exactly do you mean by the end of Hong Kong? The end of Hong Kong being what? And I think after what happened in the past few years, in order to really go into one country, two systems, I do think that, Hong Kong people really need to sit down and think, what exactly do we want to achieve out of the SAR status? Being a special administrative region, what exactly you want to achieve out of it? Of course, we very much appreciate the high level of autonomy, but at the same time, we also understand that autonomy is always in relative terms. It's not absolute. The extent of autonomy is something that we need to work on and we need to discuss. What would be the extent of autonomy, not only acceptable to the people of Hong Kong, but also acceptable to the central government? And at the same time, when we talk about the end of being what, then we probably would also need to think about, would it also be the beginning of a new development? Would this be a new beginning? Of course, a lot of people would be very pessimistic on that question because apparently the pace of democratization is not as quick as expected or desired. There seems to be a lot of frustration in terms of political development. But if we look ahead about Hong Kong's future, then we also need to reflect. In fact, if we're going to have a new vision, it would also be a vision to cover the social, economic, and cultural dimensions of Hong Kong development. Quite honestly, of course, it's my own personal view. In the past 10 years, I've heard of a lot of people saying how much they love Hong Kong, but at the same time, you like it or not, Hong Kong is also becoming less and less inclusive. The sort of atmosphere of social exclusion, in fact, is quite worrying. Equally about a new vision of economic development. There are lots of empty talks on regional integration, a lot of empty talks on technological upgrading, but what exactly is that vision? And for an economic vision, it's not just about finding a leading industry. It's also talking about employment, talking about hopes for people, and creating opportunities. Same thing about culture. So what exactly is Hong Kong culture? One of the reasons why I have a very strong anti-nostalgic dose in my presentation is that sometimes the kind of Hong Kong culture described popularly in the past 10 years are something quite strange to me. For example, I have gone through the experience of growing up in Hong Kong in a context where most of my peers and parents' generation, they have migrant background coming from mainland. And so the strong separatist notion in a lot of cultural discussions, it sounds to me rather strange and rather unfamiliar. But these are the things that we need to look into. You know, if there's a new vision, what would that be? And equally important, I do think that Hong Kong needs to think about what Hong Kong society can offer and deliver to not only its own people, to the country, and also to the wider community in the rest of the world. This is something that we need to think about as well. You know, it would be something important to go hand in hand with the development of a new vision. One country, two systems being a framework is to realize a dream, a vision. But what would it be? What are the things that we are now preparing to offer? Of course, it's not just to offer, but also to deliver, because you may want to offer a lot of things to other people, but then you probably cannot deliver it. So what are the means, what are the steps that you are able to do it? And this leads to my, maybe say, the final questions I want to raise is Hong Kong society really ready to find a new path of development? Because I do think that the so-called the old model of Hong Kong, from laissez-faire to minimal welfare, to the way that, you know, we've been running governance, running the economy, running a lot of things. I do think that it has been falling apart, even without what happened in the past 10 or 5 years. The system seems to have aged and come to a stage that, you know, it can't cope with the new environment. So these are the things that we need to think about. So in other words, one of the strong points I want to push forward is we do need to have a lot of self-reflection. But of course, this is a strange question, you may say, because for most of the time, Hong Kong rarely do self-reflection and look at ourselves and say, you know, what would be the outlook we want to adopt, how we are going to cope with the next challenge. But these are important questions that I think would be most essential in order to continue to run Hong Kong as a successful SAR within the framework of one country, two system. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tyler. Thanks for the great presentations. I think there are lots of issues that are very inspiring. We need time to digest, but I have a few questions that to stimulate the discussions of one country, two system that I would like to pose to Professor Zhang and Tyler. I think when we're talking about one country, two system, it goes back to 1980s when the idea was came out and talk about how to handle Hong Kong future, not just Hong Kong, but also Macau and Taiwan and the whole Greater China region. One of the assumptions at that time, 4 decades ago, was that China coming out of Cultural Revolution and moving towards economic modernization. It is going to be liberalized. Although at that time, nobody even the most optimistic person may not think that China will become a full democracy just like US, whatever. But at least it should be on the path of liberalizing. And at that time, one of the very important assumptions for one country, two system is that if China is on the path of liberalization, then it will have a stronger tolerance, adopting a higher level accommodation on Hong Kong distinctiveness, autonomy, exceptionalism, whatever we call it. So that is the so-called theories of democratic reunification that in the 1980s. And at that time, not just Hong Kong people adopt this kind of logic. Actually, the Western international society, they are also adopting some kinds of similar logic. For example, in 1990s, when President Bill Clinton talked about adopting, encouraging China going into the WTO, they believe that economic liberalizations will help bring about a more rational China and a strong China, but also will be integrated into the so-called liberal world order, something like that. So that are the assumption that in the 1980s, 1990s, but unfortunately, it seems that these assumptions no longer stand now. So my question is, how you would, looking back 40 years later, because in 1980s, you two both not just participate as scholars, but also as politicians, take part in the discussions of one country, two system. 40 years later, how you would comment on that assumption? And if this assumption can really can't stand anymore, then what is the implications on one country, two system, how Hong Kong people can cope with that situation? Yeah.
So maybe let me try to come up with an answer from my own experience. I think it is a very complex matter because now, speaking for myself, when I was a young student, I would say I was very sort of anti-colonial, in a way anti-British in political terms. And we have never doubted that we are Chinese and we want China to be great, because my parents' generation taught me that China suffered so severely in the first half of the last century because the nation was not strong. We are subject to humiliation by others. But of course, we have both the sense of trying to achieve as much as we can. I mean, democracy, probably in the Western sense, and against the kind of suppressive politics of Hong Kong at that time. We are talking about the 60s and the 70s for my own sort of adult formation. And, but at the same time, we have to be rather realistic. I would say that when some of us sort of advocated democratic reunification, we realized even at that time that we are probably the minority, not the mainstream. The mainstream people basically will prefer no change, not that they love the British administration so much, but because they doubted the maintenance very much because of Cultural Revolution, the political crackdown in the 50s and the 60s. But if we talk about liberalization, the theme that you just put up, it depends on how you understand liberalization. because Hong Kong in the 70s and even in the early 80s was not as liberal as today. I mean, you could not imagine that you could actually criticize the government so much. You cannot challenge the British authority over Hong Kong. And Britain at that time also was very pragmatic and realistic. Britain will not allow any movies or anything that would upset what was described as good neighbor relations, meaning the relation with China. So there was a limit to so-called freedom and liberty. And that was the kind of Hong Kong that, like or not, Beijing accepted. So Beijing put up the one country, two systems formula based on what it understood Hong Kong to be in the 1980s. Of course, things have changed a lot during the last 4 decades. So looking back, I think we were not sort of given a wrong impression. So, I mean, we like to believe that we would do more, but the hard reality at that time was that was the kind of Hong Kong that Beijing promised to preserve. Of course, history never stayed unchanged. Now, as to the Western world's or the US understanding of China, I think that's why I mentioned in my earlier presentation that you have to understand China's evolution in a historical context. It's the kind of authoritarian system is not just because of communism. It's not just because of the CCP. It's also because of China's long years of administrative history. I mean, if you look at Russia, you look at India, you look at other countries, you can still find that kind of historical footprint on today's practices and system. China did not say that, or the CCP did not say that it will embrace liberalization. For it, liberalization in the 80s and 90s meant economic liberalization, and that's what it has done already. But remember, even back in the 1980s, in 1987, there was this anti-bourgeois liberalization, which led to the downfall of Hu Yaobang. That was 1987. And that was a prelude, in a way, to the 1987 pro-democracy movement in Beijing, and then the crackdown by the armed forces. So if you say that in the 1990s, the US and some European countries, they were trying to bet on China's political liberalization, probably they were assuming too much, in my view. This is not how China would develop. I'm not saying that this is good or bad. I'm trying to put it in a historical context.
Yeah, I think it's very important that we get the chronology right. Because don't forget, when we turn the clock back to 1982, 83, when the Hong Kong futures status becoming an issue, the liberalization thesis has not yet been developed. Of course, there's always that modernization theory, Deaton assumptions in the Cold War days, that whatever you can soften the communists would be something that the Western power would like to do it. But the liberalization thesis didn't exist in the early days of the Hong Kong's Sino-British negotiation. So in a way that a lot of people have forgotten that, during the very early 1980s, when we talk about whether Hong Kong belongs to China or not, and when we talk about, democratic return to China, at that time, the hope was that, through Hong Kong's change of status in 1997, this would allow Hong Kong to have an opportunity to democratize. Not to democratize China, but to democratize Hong Kong, because in the early 1980s, I think none of the social activists at that time in Hong Kong, whether student activists or even the Trotskyists, would believe that the colonial government would allow Hong Kong to be democratized. even the discussion of public sphere and civil society in China was developed upon the basis of the Poland experience. And at the very beginning, it was more of a projection of a kind of hope rather than a kind of actual assessment, because as well put by Anthony, that even in 87, there was the anti-bourgeois liberalization campaign. And then later on, 1989. It was only after 1992, after Deng Xiaoping have his, official visit to southern China again, and then the marketization pace and the scale and scope of marketization changed enormously. Then people, especially in the West, start talking about two things. One is the formation of civil society in China through consumption, through leisure, spending money, and so on and so forth. The other thing would be about the rise of private enterprise. At one point of time, people would think that, the private enterprise would grow and then the state enterprise would shrink. So as a result of that, probably the party would also shrink as well. Of course, later on, the whole story was a very different one. Now we understand that, instead of private enterprise becoming more powerful, then probably you find state enterprise being very, very powerful. The party has not reduced its own scope of control and so on and so forth. But still, you also need to understand that if you look back again at the chronology, one may not be happy with the current development in China. But at the same time, if you draw too much parallel between the existing Beijing regime and also the current practice with what happened in the 60s and 50s in China, is not exactly the same thing. Somehow the scope of society within China definitely would be very different from the old days in 50s and 60s. So it depends on what you mean by saying that, okay, that Western liberalization thesis doesn't quite work out. So what's the basis of one country, two system? The point I want to make is the whole original framework of one country, two system didn't quite rely heavily on the 90s liberalization thesis. In fact, it rests upon a very important component is China would want Hong Kong to remain, well, in Anthony's word, would be exceptional. And Hong Kong would still have a role to play within the Chinese framework and in the context of the global economy. I think that part is the enduring basis and foundation of one country, two systems, rather than just the hope of saying gradually that China would liberalize and so they would converge. I don't think that, especially within Hong Kong, the expectation of what happened after 1997 rests upon that kind of convergence.
Thank you very much. And another related question is the role of international community, because as we have mentioned, one country, two system probably is not just an issue between the people of Hong Kong and Chinese government. Because Hong Kong is exceptional, Hong Kong is distinctive, Hong Kong is useful to China because of its connections with international community since 1841. So the point is, one country, two system, why Beijing tolerate or willing to grant an exceptional high degree of autonomy to Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is so special within China. It is the only place with extensive Western presence. And the presence is not just about capital, business. When the Westerner come, like it or not, they will bring their own values, their culture, their politics, their geopolitical agenda. And in the past, when we're talking about one country, two system, Beijing seems exercising a higher degree of tolerance, not just to Hong Kong people, but also to the presence of the rest. And unavoidably, when the Westerner come, when they stay here, they will have their own thought, their own definition about one country, two system. Okay, and on the other hand, we all know that Beijing have its own version, own definition, own model of one country, two system, and trying to execute it more directly in recent years. But on the other hand, like it or not, the Western community, particularly the US, they also have their own version of one country, two system. So that's what we experienced in the past few months. On the one hand, Beijing say, oh, the new national security law, the whole regime is based on one country, two system principle. It is one of the practice to refine the one country, two system in China sense. But on the other hand, US, Donald Trump said, okay, that's not one country, two system, so Hong Kong is not two system anymore. Hong Kong is just another city, so I scrap all the distinctive treatments on Hong Kong under the US Hong Kong Policy Act. Hong Kong is no longer distinctive, blah, blah, blah. And they are influential. Because if the Western community, if the whole Western community said they don't like Beijing version of one country, two system, they will retreat. They will gradually retreat, or at least they may scale down their presence in Hong Kong. If in this sense, Hong Kong values, the so-called, we always talk, we discover our values to China, will not vulnerably be undermined. So my question is, how the people of Hong Kong can deal with properly two different definitions of one country, two system. On the one hand, we have the China model, China version, China definition, but on the other hand, we have the Western, particularly the US version. And under the so-called New Cold War, one of the clash between China and US will be Hong Kong. And fundamentally, it's about two different versions of one country, two system. So how can we deal with that?
Well, I think Hong Kong is still very important, or still being regarded as important to China, because it is global, because of international city background and status even until now, despite the latest development. Of course, as you put it, there are two versions or interpretations of one country, two systems. What Beijing would consider as the original intention of the one country, two systems, that one country must come first because of sovereignty, the issue that Dialogue also has alluded to earlier. The Western world, I think, has somehow taken a rather idealistic, from their perspective, interpretation. And their interpretation, I mean, putting things historically, has been influenced by what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. This end of history thesis that liberty, liberal democracy in the broad sense, is the ultimate destiny of humanity. And the US has been pushing that as the only way, I mean, as a sole way to define the world and to define global affairs. Now, because of that kind of, if I may put it, diplomatic arrogance, now that shaped how it deals with Hong Kong. But whether or not Hong Kong will have one country, two systems, in my view, is ultimately determined by Beijing. The US or the Western powers may see Hong Kong as no longer that separate from the mainland. But Beijing will continue to allow Hong Kong to practice institutions, to have operations quite distinct from the rest of China. So that's why I have always said that no matter how advanced economically or in terms of growth Shenzhen would become, Shenzhen will not replace Hong Kong. Shenzhen cannot replace Hong Kong because it's different from Hong Kong. The only city that can replace Hong Kong, if Hong Kong really goes down the road of a downfall, is Singapore, because of its rather east-west uniqueness. And so, but as far as I can see, China would still need a Hong Kong or city that would allow it to do things quite differently from the mainland within the one nation parameters. So how do you strike the balance? I think that is a very difficult act. But the main challenge whether to Beijing or to people in Hong Kong. Now, as for the West, if you look at what the Trump administration have done, basically is, well, Hong Kong is no longer one country, two systems, therefore destroy Hong Kong. That's what basically is the message from the US. Now, so I don't think China would allow Hong Kong to just degenerate that way. Of course, Beijing has its own design over Hong Kong, but it also depends on how Hong Kong people will continue to make its distinctness visible. If we simply follow the fatalistic path, then there's no use to save Hong Kong. For those fatalists, they will simply hope that China will fall, the end of China. But that, I don't know if there's the end of China, therefore you don't have one country, two systems anyway. But whether or not China will continue to grow is important. 4 decades ago, back in the 80s, 70s, nobody, including Deng Xiaoping, could anticipate that China could become the China today. Similarly, in the next 3 to 4 decades, I don't think anybody could have the crystal ball to say, well, what China will become. China will continue to evolve. You have elements of centralism, you have elements of localism. I mean, I'm not talking about Hong Kong, but other provinces or cities on the mainland. You have liberal elements. You also have authoritarian elements. Every country is trying to steer its way through these forces. I mean, look at the US. Do you think that Trump is so liberal? And sometimes he simply enforces his own will on US politics. Now, you can find a lot of similarities in other countries. So it's all a matter of trying to steer away all of these competing forces, different pressures, and somehow every country has its own sort of national legacy that you cannot really get away from. Now, for Hong Kong, our legacy over the last almost 200 years has been so different from that of mainland China. And that is part of the reason why the reunification, the integration has been so challenging or sometimes so painful. But we have to go through that.
Well, I think the international power or international politics thesis is interesting, but I can see the difference between what I would call a variable approach and a historical approach. If you adopt a variable approach and saying that, whether Western powers like US, UK would have an impact on Hong Kong's development, then your discussion would turn out to be either yes or no. But I tend to think that, this kind of variable, you see it as one factor, is misleading because you need to put it into historical context. Under what historical context, when that kind of international influence would have an impact, positive or negative, is very contextual. So for example, I think a week ago, Anthony and I actually joined a webinar organized by our colleagues from Japan and South Korea. Their experience of US impact on democratization in South Korea and Taiwan have a very different perception because they understand that at that time, US pressure on South Korea military regime, on KMT in Taiwan, actually would help to push democratization. But even from our South Korean friend would say, now you're using US to press Beijing to allow Hong Kong to have democratization, probably would only backfire rather than having any impact on it. Because it's a very different context, it's a very different game. So it's not about whether US have impact or not, but under what kind of situation. So if you put it back into the Hong Kong's historical experience, then it turned out to be very interesting because, say, for example, from 1949 onwards for Hong Kong, there's a period of time when containment of communism was a big topic. So quite honestly, between 1948 all the way up to 1953-54, the colonial government, the UK government, were very, very harsh on the local and Chinese communists in Hong Kong. basically all our film censorship, a lot of the emergency laws, all of them are tools to suppress the communists. And then the communists withdrew. And then that's the beginning of a more peaceful kind of period until 1967. And then after 1967 came a period of time when the international scene changed enormously, particularly that Henry Kissinger visited China and then helped Nixon to meet Chairman Mao and so on and so forth. That was an extended friendly period between China and US. And Hong Kong got a lot of advantage out of that. So it turned out to be very interesting that, actually, if Hong Kong wants to retain stability and prosperity, the historical experience seems that we need to promote harmony between US and China, rather than, like some people recently, that putting their bets on Donald Trump and hope that, this would enhance rivalry and conflict, so as a result, Hong Kong would benefit. It seems to be the other way around. So whether international power has impact or not, of course, it's always yes. But the question is under what context, under what situation, that it would have what kind of impact, positive or negative. Then you have to contextualize it.
It's another question that to continue the discussion is, yes, we know that China is a very important, or probably the most important structural factor that affect the future of one country, two system, and we have also briefly discussed the implications of international community as another structure. My question is, okay, how we should manage these structures? These structural factors always have been changing. They always have tensions. And Tai Lok and Professor Zhang, you both mentioned about how to manage the one country, two system, how to improve governance, something like that. So the ideas that immediately pop up in my mind is, okay, we have all these kinds of structures, very complicated structure, a lot of conflicts, tensions between the structure. But where is the agents? It boils down to the questions of political leadership. Okay, we know that for many decades, or even since the founding of Hong Kong as a free port by the British in 1841, we are already in very complicated environments. It's not the day one that Hong Kong people is facing these kinds of complexity. But the point is, unfortunately, it seems that after 1997, particularly in recent years, we, the people of Hong Kong, we do not have a organized or stable, forward-looking agency that can help us to manage these kinds of complexity. In the past, we put the hope on the civil servants. We put the hope of the business elite, also put the hope on the Democrats. We hope that the parties, the civil servants, the business elite, they will help manage all kinds of challenge facing Hong Kong society, make sure that Hong Kong will be useful to China, to the Western world, so that we can keep our distinctiveness, our exceptionalism, whatever. But the point is, where is the political leadership now? Well, okay, we know a lot of challenge, lots of tensions, as you two have pointed out. But how to manage this is go down to a questions of political leadership. At this moment of time, because of all the handicap of Hong Kong political system, all its structural constraint, how can we, okay, we know all this challenge. We know we should deal with that. We should better manage it. But where is the agents? How can we build agents to better manage it? For me, it is not just an academic question, it's a practical, probably the most important issue that we need to face. Okay, we know a lot of challenge, but how to deal with it? And to deal with it, after all, it boils down to the questions of leadership and agency. So do you have any thoughts on this aspect?
Well, if we talk about agents, I think in a broad sense, the agents are ourselves. I think we still need parties, we still need Democrats, we still need the pro-establishment camp because they do represent certain sectors of the community. We still need the business and professional elites. We still need the bureaucrats. They're all part of the scene. But the major factor is whether they still operate under the previous, in a sense, as what Dialogue has put it very eloquently, outdated, no longer functioning paradigm. So we are now, before us is a major paradigm change because the context has changed, the historical juncture is a different one from 1997 or the 1980s. So if we still carry on with the old mindset, we are not able to solve our problems. Now, in a way, I can see that Beijing has now come to a point because Beijing has been sort of being challenged by what happens in Hong Kong, the international reaction, that it could no longer live with the past. So for Beijing, it's now saying, well, we need to have a new beginning. Of course, whether that new beginning is to a renewed prosperity impact of Hong Kong, or we simply becomes weaker and Hong Kong would be no longer as important as before. Now that is the big question before Hong Kong people. But we have to really see the opportunity for Hong Kong to maintain its uniqueness. But of course, the way to define Hong Kong's uniqueness can be both general and specific. In a general sense, Hong Kong still needs to be international. In my view, that's the only way that makes Hong Kong different from mainland. From Shenzhen, from Shanghai, even Shenzhen and Shanghai now aspire to be more international than before. So if Hong Kong is no longer international, if Hong Kong sort of withdraw further from the international arena, is Hong Kong, I mean, including government, the business sector, just look inward towards the mainland for solutions instead of being both important to the mainland and to the international community, then Hong Kong would not find a new future. In terms of value to China, I think it's still useful to remind ourselves what Premier Li Keqiang has said. What he said is, 國家所需，香港所長. Hong Kong should be good in areas where the nation needs. We should not be just good in areas where Shenzhen can satisfy the national wants, or other cities can do that. We have to find some way that this is only Hong Kong that can really bring added value to the nation, because China is developing. China, of course, would like to exploit the strengths of different cities and sectors in the nation. So this is a challenge to Hong Kong. If we are no longer as international as before, then we will fall in the trap of really mainlandization, and that will not make Hong Kong unique. We are just another city. But at the same time, in order to gain the confidence and the trust of Beijing to let Hong Kong be more outgoing, so to speak, then we should not let Beijing have the impression that we are now a political threat, a political burden to the nation. I think that this is a very delicate balancing act that we have to make. Now, our leaders, you are right, we need leaders. We need leaders with a new mindset. But of course, if it's just the leaders having new perspectives, but the population still seriously divided, some still so fond of the past, even though the past cannot be replicated, some basically going for seeing that there's no future for Hong Kong and therefore they're not willing to invest in Hong Kong's future, then no leaders will actually turn around the scene. But we are now in this very critical juncture that people in Hong Kong, leaders, the ordinary people, we really have to ask ourselves a serious question. Are we willing to just let things continue without any agency, as you put it, trying to turn around Hong Kong?
Well, my answer would be very short. That if we talk about agency in the sense that, in the sense of identifiable social groups, or category of people, then no. At this moment, I don't think we would be able to find agencies of that definition. But at the same time, I think it's about time for Hong Kong, as I tried repeatedly argue in my presentation, is this is a time that we need to go back, have a good self-reflection, and to develop a new vision. So in terms of facilitating the rise of new agencies, I think we need a new agenda. And this is a time that I think Hong Kong, definitely no way of going back yesterday's once more, but rather you need to go forward and to work out a new agenda. And to be honest to ourselves, I think for a long, long time, we've been talking too many empty talks. For example, I fully agree with Anthony's point on we need to be global, we need to be international. But at the same time, we also need to be honest to ourselves. For a long time, when we say we are very international, it's only meaning that we are using English and connected with the English-speaking world. If we are a little bit more serious about One Belt and Road, we need Arabic, we need Russian, we need a far more broader, bigger global vision. Same thing about Greater Bay Area. I mean, there are things that Hong Kong shouldn't go into because this is not our strength. This is area not our own comparative advantage. There are blocks within mainland that they won't allow open it up for you. So forget it. Focus on things that you are capable of doing. So it comes to a point that you may say it's painful, but at the same time, the nice things about going back to square one is, then you start moving forward, and that with a new agenda, a new vision, then I think it would help us to identify a new agency to promote change.
Thank you very much. Time is running out. I think we must stop here. Thanks for the very inspiring observation from Professor Zhang and Professor Lui. So we need to stop here. Thanks for very good discussions about one country, two system. We surely need new assessment on the new paradigm, new agenda, and then probably we can have a new agents to help lead Hong Kong getting out of the current situation and face the new challenge. In the afternoon, we will have another sections about Hong Kong study in different places. We have scholars and speakers from different countries to share with us how Hong Kong have been studied in their country. So please come back after lunch. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.